Chapter 561, Moody's Identity. The clouds had cleared, revealing a bright moon, and everything had finally settled. In the office, Atticus Blaine and Dumbledore sat across from each other on a plush sofa. Their expressions were unexpectedly calm, no panic, anger, excitement, or confusion. Instead, there was a shared sense of relief now that the truth had been unveiled. The fire in the fireplace had died down, leaving only the smoldering red embers. The light from the entrance wall served as the sole illumination in the room. Atticus leaned back into the soft cushions, his eyes following the wisps of steam rising from his teacup, as he absent-mindedly rubbed his chin. "Is there polyjuice potion in the flask?" Atticus inquired. "I agree with you, Atticus," Dumbledore replied with composure. "That suggests one thing at least. Alastor, our real Alastor, should be alive, hidden away by the impostor, so that he can take Alastor's hair whenever needed. I suspect Alastor is in the impostor's office." "What do you think, Atticus?" "It seems a reasonable assumption," Atticus nodded slightly, his gaze piercing through the misty air to rest on Dumbledore's aged face. Despite the obscurity of his expression, Atticus couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. Alastor Moody had been Dumbledore's friend for many years, yet Dumbledore remained remarkably composed upon learning of his friend's predicament. His decisiveness and cold logic were evident, traits that had always been awe-inspiring in the greatest wizard of their time. "I don't understand," Atticus pondered aloud after a moment, meeting Dumbledore's blue eyes through the half-moon spectacles. "I recall you once told me that when the Dementors captured Sirius and stormed the campus last year, there was a slight change in my Patronus. You mentioned that you could glimpse into a person's soul to some extent, Headmaster Dumbledore. So, how could you be deceived by polyjuice potion, especially when Professor Moody is an old friend?" "I won't make excuses for my mistake, Atticus," Dumbledore admitted, a trace of bitterness touching his lips. "It was a grave error. I trusted Alastor Moody. He was once my right-hand man, and a steadfast supporter. This trust led me to overlook some of the peculiar behaviors exhibited by the impostor after arriving at Hogwarts. As for observing a person's soul—" Dumbledore paused, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I do possess this ability, but it's not as simple as summoning food from the kitchen. It requires a cost. Until I see Tom's end clearly, I wish to remain healthy. Tom would take pride in knowing I am so old that I need assistance to walk. As a professor, I hope to maintain a basic dignity in front of my former students." Atticus studied Dumbledore intently, unsure if his explanation was a cover-up or the truth. For years, the world had speculated about the extent of Albus Dumbledore's abilities. Since his legendary duel with Grindelwald, few had witnessed Dumbledore wield a wand. Many believed that, at over 100 years old, his powers had waned. They revered him not just for his magical prowess, but for his wisdom and the respect he commanded. Even those close to Dumbledore often saw him more as a spiritual leader and pillar, trusting in his wisdom rather than his might. Perhaps Atticus Blaine was the person who understood Dumbledore's strength best. Despite Dumbledore's frail appearance, there was always an underlying sense of power that reminded Atticus that this legendary centenarian wizard was far from the weak figure outsiders perceived. Atticus even suspected that Dumbledore possessed some kind of trump card, a secret weapon reserved for intimidating Voldemort or perhaps even himself. "Do you think," Atticus averted his gaze and asked softly, "Headmaster Dumbledore, do you think it's necessary for us to uncover the identity of the fake Moody?" "Ah, of course," Dumbledore replied, rising from the sofa. "Although we've reached a tacit understanding about allowing Tom to regain his magic, we must at least know who we're dealing with. Come on, Atticus, let's get to the bottom of this." The cold night was harsh, and Hogwarts, perched on its high ground, had succumbed to slumber. The only ones seemingly awake in the entire castle were the headmaster and the director of the student safety office. Of course, the diligent house elves in the kitchen were likely busy as well. Dumbledore and Atticus traversed the covered bridge suspended high in the sky, navigated the labyrinthine corridors, and arrived at the tower where Dumbledore's office was located. Inside the headmaster's office, Fawkes perched on a golden branch above the brazier while the portraits of previous headmasters slumbered on the walls. The room was filled with the tinkling and rustling of peculiar alchemical devices, creating a symphony of curious sounds. "Please have a seat, Atticus. We need some assistance with a few tools," Dumbledore said. Atticus settled into his usual chair as Dumbledore, with a spring in his step, retrieved a delicate silver instrument from a lower shelf and placed it on his desk. For some reason, Atticus sensed an excitement in Dumbledore's movements, akin to Hermione discovering a final exam question that perfectly suited her. "Let's see," Dumbledore murmured, tapping the instrument lightly with his wand. Atticus felt an obscure wave sweep through the room, quickly expanding beyond the headmaster's office. Time seemed to pause for over 10 seconds, and then, without warning, the instrument began to operate, emitting a rhythmic tinkling sound. Wisps of light green smoke emerged from a small silver tube at the top, gathering in the air and encircling Atticus. Both he and Dumbledore stood, observing the smoke as it thickened and stabilized, waiting for it to fully form. Suddenly, just a second before the answer materialized, a brighter green light flashed within the mist. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened, and with a swift wave of his wand, the steady smoke dispersed and the bright green light vanished from their sight. "Oh, that's interesting," Dumbledore remarked with enthusiasm. "Very vigilant and careful. I believe this individual was prepared on every level, including their soul." He looked at Atticus with a smile. "This unknown gentleman or lady's method of disguising the soul is quite remarkable. I almost touched it, but in my opinion, this doesn't resemble a wizard's technique." If Atticus couldn't grasp Dumbledore's hint, he would indeed be foolish. In fact, it was a conclusion that required little thought. After a long moment of silence, Atticus sighed and shook his head. "Vedia Cleona, she's resolved to spend the rest of her life in Azkaban." End of this chapter. Chapter 562, Campus Check-In. The last day of October fell on a Saturday. Typically, students would sleep in and have a late breakfast. However, today was different. Most of the young wizards were up earlier than usual for a weekend. As they hurried downstairs to the foyer, they were taken aback by the transformed decorations in the Great Hall. Above them, a swarm of live bats fluttered across the enchanted ceiling, while hundreds of small, carved pumpkins squinted mischievously from every corner. The walls were adorned with vibrant Halloween decorations, reminding everyone of the festive day. It suddenly dawned on the young wizards that today was Halloween. In previous years, the Halloween feast was a highlight, eagerly anticipated by all. But this year, the holiday had to make way for the grand Triwizard Tournament. Few lingered over the enormous pumpkin, as large as a small house, which Hagrid had conjured with the expansion charm in front of the Great Hall. The students, one by one, gathered excitedly in the foyer, their eyes fixed on the pumpkin, which was about to be part of a grand experiment. Fred and George Weasley pointed animatedly at the scene. "What makes them think they can pull it off?" Hermione remarked, her tone dripping with skepticism as she observed Fred and George's eager attempts. "An aging potion. It's absurd to think Professor Dumbledore would be fooled by such a simple trick." Harry, intrigued by the outcome, responded to Hermione's criticism. "I bet the students trying this aren't just Fred and George. If they become champions, they'll gain instant fame in the magical world and earn a lot of galleons. Not many can resist that temptation." "Yes, Dumbledore is indeed remarkable," Hermione replied, clearly dissatisfied with Harry's comment. She frowned at him, while Ron, standing nearby, watched his brothers with intense curiosity. But precisely because of that, he might overlook the aging potion. Wizards like him often focus on who can break their spells, not on minor tricks. "Your analysis is quite thorough, Ron," Hermione said sarcastically, rolling her eyes. "But have you considered that if these tricks succeed and the Hogwarts champion is underage, what will Professor Dumbledore and Professor Blaine say to Beauxbatons and Durmstrang? Hogwarts isn't the only school vying to host the Triwizard Tournament. They've likely gone to great lengths to ensure its success." Hermione's insight caught Harry and Ron off guard. They hadn't considered this angle, and Harry was certain Fred and George hadn't either. "Should we stop them?" Harry asked hesitantly, glancing at Fred and George, who were laughing and joking. He deeply respected Professors Dumbledore and Blaine. While he wished to be a Hogwarts champion, he wouldn't risk causing diplomatic issues for them. Ron, feeling guilty, looked at Fred and George with a more composed demeanor. He had initially planned to try their method if it worked. But after Hermione's reminder, considering Professor Blaine's kindness to their family, he realized that if becoming a champion would cause trouble for Professor Blaine, his mother might not wait for him to compete in the third task before tearing him apart. "Oh, I don't think so," Hermione said, crossing her arms and disapprovingly watching the twins' antics. "They'll learn their lessons soon enough." The excerpt. Atticus Blaine's warning seemed to have been completely forgotten. What you see before you is one of the renowned natural landscapes of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, celebrated throughout the British wizarding world, the Black Lake. In the early morning, the sun's gentle warmth had yet to fully lift the mist from the lake's surface. As late autumn approached, a row of dark green willow branches by the lakeside swayed rhythmically in the breeze. Atticus Blaine appeared to be in high spirits, or at least he gave that impression. To a group of visitors from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, he spoke with enthusiasm, seemingly oblivious to their sleepy or existential expressions. Earlier that morning, Mr. Atticus Blaine had hurried to the stations of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, eagerly offering to introduce Hogwarts to everyone. No one could resist the chance to engage with the famous Atticus Blaine, especially when he was offering a tour of Hogwarts, a school with a rich history and a pivotal role in the world of magical education. Unexpectedly, Mr. Blaine led the group directly to the chilly lakeside, where he spoke at length about the unobstructed view of the lake. In the crowd, Fleur gritted her teeth and glared at Atticus Blaine. The previous night, after leaving Atticus's office, she had felt a hint of happiness. Dumbledore had agreed to Atticus's request to show her around Hogwarts, offering a rare opportunity for them to be alone. Yet to her dismay, he had brought along a tour group. There are many aquatic magical creatures living beneath the Black Lake, including mermaids, grindylows, and a giant squid, which is rare in the world. According to internal records, this squid has resided in these waters since Hogwarts was founded and may have even interacted with the four great founders of Hogwarts. This intriguing tidbit piqued the interest of many, who eagerly scanned the lake, hoping to catch a glimpse of the giant squid. All right, ladies and gentlemen, follow me. We are now going to visit another noteworthy attraction on the Hogwarts campus. Atticus clapped his hands energetically and maneuvered through the Beauxbatons students who were huddled together against the cold wind. He pretended not to notice Fleur, who, holding a cute little girl in a delicate dress, glared at him with frustration. The Humping Willow. Atticus led the group across the lawn to the edge of the field, pointing to the large tree that, feeling threatened by the crowd, anxiously waved its branches with a rustling sound. This is a very rare magical plant. It requires a specific environment to thrive, and generally only survives in areas rich in magic. As far as I know, there is only one like it in the UK. Of course. Atticus gestured with his fingers, causing a large clump of moss at his feet to float and drift slowly toward the Humping Willow. Snap! With a whistling sound that sliced through the air, there was a sharp, crisp crack. Under the Humping Willow's heavy blow, the moss scattered like mud, and the debris rained down on the onlookers. As you can see, it's dangerous. Atticus's voice took on a more serious tone as he addressed the startled guests, who were now exclaiming in surprise. You are about to spend an entire year at Hogwarts, so I must caution you against approaching it out of curiosity during your free time. Every year, a few freshmen attempt to prove their skills by confronting it. As for the fate of these students, you can consult the school nurse at Hogwarts, Miss Pomfrey. I'm sorry, it seems like there might be some confusion. Could you please provide the text you would like me to improve? Chapter 563, The Unlucky Furong. After a spine-chilling scream, bits of moss scattered across the faces of the leading young wizards. Shocked and in pain, they retreated, causing a brief chaos. However, once the commotion subsided, Atticus Blaine noticed that few seemed intimidated by the formidable Humping Willow. The young wizards from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang watched the thrashing branches with curiosity. The willow's branches lying on the ground seemed indifferent to his earlier warnings. Atticus mused that perhaps Hagrid should consider placing some barriers around the Humping Willow. After all, the visiting students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang were guests from afar, and any harm befalling them at Hogwarts, outside of the competitions, could potentially lead to a serious diplomatic incident. "Where are we going next, Professor Blaine?" an eager young witch from Beauxbatons inquired. "Next," Atticus began, but was interrupted by a raised hand from the Beauxbatons group. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the speaker. "Could we possibly visit the Chamber of Secrets at Hogwarts?" Fleur Delacour asked, her interest piqued. To her, the Hogwarts campus, with its stark contrast to Beauxbatons' artistic and meticulously crafted buildings, seemed like a desolate, dilapidated courtyard. Yet there was something that intrigued her. She looked at Atticus, a mischievous smile playing on her lips, her clear eyes gleaming. "I mean the legendary Slytherin Chamber of Secrets. It's said that you captured the incredible basilisk there, ending the terror that haunted the Muggle-born students at Hogwarts for centuries." Fleur tossed her silver hair, feigning admiration for Atticus. Her tone was that of a young witch meeting her idol, which posed a problem. At Beauxbatons, Fleur Delacour was the object of many boys' dreams. The young Beauxbatons wizards, who had initially held Atticus Blaine in high regard, now looked at him with envy. Atticus was unfazed by their hostile glances, but Fleur's request was troublesome. "Ah, surely you wouldn't deny such a simple request, Blaine?" Karkaroff interjected sweetly. Though he smiled, his eyes remained cold and calculating. Earlier that morning, when Atticus had visited the ghost ship where Durmstrang resided to offer a tour of the Hogwarts campus, Karkaroff had suggested they visit the Hall of Admiration together. Atticus suspected Karkaroff feared his Durmstrang students might cause trouble. Visiting Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets was out of the question. Although the basilisk was no longer there, the chamber still held significant secrets of Hogwarts. "I'm sorry, Miss Delacour," Atticus replied apologetically. "I'm afraid your wish cannot be granted. As you know, when I subdued the basilisk, a fierce battle ensued, leaving the chamber in ruins. For safety reasons, we sealed it off, and now no one can enter." Karkaroff seemed poised to argue, but Atticus silenced him with a stern look. "Besides, there's nothing of interest there," Atticus continued with a smile. "Apart from crumbling walls and countless animal remains in the decaying mud, there's nothing to see. Nothing at all." "Terrible," murmured Gabrielle, as delicate as porcelain, clutching Fleur's hand imploringly. "I don't want to go there, sister," Gabrielle said, her voice tinged with apprehension. Fleur, who usually wore a proud demeanor, softened at her sister's words. She gently comforted Gabrielle, casting a glance of mild reproach at Atticus Blaine. It was clear she understood that his suggestion was merely an excuse. "May I go and have a look, Professor Blaine?" Gabrielle asked, her voice a mix of timidity and admiration. She clung tightly to Fleur's hand, her eyes wide as she pointed towards the edge of the forbidden forest. Despite her young appearance, which made her seem more like a 5- or 6-year-old due to the unique nature of Vila blood, Gabrielle was eager to explore. Atticus Blaine, unable to resist the charm of such an endearing child, smiled warmly. Of course," he replied. "That was one of the places we planned to visit today." He gestured towards a small house. "That is the home of Rubeus Hagrid, the gamekeeper and professor of care of magical creatures at Hogwarts. Hagrid has dedicated nearly half a century to Hogwarts, guiding young wizards into the magical world and watching them grow into remarkable individuals. Apart from Albus Dumbledore, he is one of the most respected wizards here." "Wow," Gabrielle exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. In Paris, Fleur had spent time with Atticus Blaine, meeting many prominent figures in the European wizarding world. Yet, she had never seen him speak so kindly to anyone before. Fleur's eyelashes fluttered as she glanced at Gabrielle, then back at Atticus, her expression a mix of surprise and determination. "Come on, everyone," Atticus encouraged. "For the next half-year, Hagrid will be your professor of care of magical creatures. He's very friendly and might even offer you a cup of tea." As Fleur prepared to leave, she suddenly realized Gabrielle's hand had slipped from hers. To her astonishment, her usually timid sister had run to the front of the group, eagerly following Atticus Blaine. "Oh, that's surprising," a Beauxbatons student remarked, noticing Fleur's reaction. She chuckled and said, "Gabrielle is usually shy around strangers. It seems she really likes Professor Blaine." Fleur felt a pang of emotion she couldn't quite place. Most people wouldn't be interested in a simple hut and a large vegetable garden, but Gabrielle, trailing behind Atticus, seemed utterly captivated. At Beauxbatons, every plant was meticulously cultivated for beauty, making Hagrid's vegetable garden a novel sight for her. "Did Mr. Hagrid grow all the pumpkins in the Great Hall, Professor Blaine?" Gabrielle asked, peering curiously over the garden fence. Hagrid had already harvested the large pumpkins, turning them into jack-o'-lanterns for the Great Hall, while the medium-sized ones had been sent to the kitchen. The garden now held only small pumpkins, their green fruits no larger than a baby's fist, looking adorably quaint. "Yes, little one," Atticus replied, gently patting her head. "I can pick one for you to take back as a souvenir." Gabrielle's face lit up with delight, just as Fleur squeezed in beside her. Perhaps it was because she had known Atticus before his rise to fame, but Fleur felt a sense of familiarity and warmth in his presence. Atticus Blaine, who was often feared by others, didn't seem so intimidating to her. Fleur glared at Atticus and said, "No need to trouble unfamiliar people, Gabrielle. I can help you. Be careful, Miss Delacour. There's something in this pumpkin patch," Atticus warned, but Fleur, eager to prove herself as a capable sister, ignored him. She dashed forward, bypassing the fence, and rushed into Hagrid's vegetable garden. Boom! With a sudden flash of fire and a deafening bang, Fleur's face was left charred, and she whimpered in pain. Stumbling backward, she fell into the muddy pumpkin patch. The explosion had torn the hem of her school uniform, revealing her smooth white calves, which caused the eyes of all the Durmstrang and Beauxbatons boys to widen in surprise. "There are snails," Atticus added sympathetically. End of this chapter. Chapter 564. She Likes You. The irritated blast-ended Scroot erupted with a loud noise, capturing the attention of nearly everyone near Hagrid's hut. Several Hogwarts students who were wandering the grounds turned their heads toward the commotion. As they noticed the source of the disturbance, some began to jog over, eager to see what was happening. Even Atticus Blaine was taken aback by the sudden noise, and Gabrielle's youthful face was etched with panic. She called out for her sister, her voice tinged with fear, and instinctively moved toward the pumpkin patch in a flustered attempt to assess the situation. Just as she was about to step onto the ivy-covered ground, Fleur Delacour's urgent voice rang out, "Don't come here, Gabrielle. It's not safe." Gabrielle halted immediately, standing there helplessly, unsure of what to do next. Karkaroff, too, was startled by the explosion, but quickly regained his composure. He glanced at Fleur, who had fallen in the pumpkin patch, his expression stern. "The Beauxbatons champion is injured. Blaine, I think we should inform Madame Maxime. Do you need me to go?" Atticus Blaine cast an indifferent glance at Karkaroff and chose to ignore him. Instead, he deftly climbed over the fence, swiftly approached Fleur, and crouched down to examine her injury. "What's going on here?" Hagrid appeared from behind his house, his trousers and shoes caked with mud and water, evidence of his recent return from the Forbidden Forest. He was puzzled to see students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang gathered around his vegetable garden. However, upon noticing Professor Blaine amidst the lush ivy and the female student seated on the ground, his expression shifted to one of panic, and he hurried toward the garden. "Oh, it's Professor Blaine and that girl from Beauxbatons." Harry, Hermione, and Ron had come to find Hagrid. Hearing the commotion, they ran over, joining the small crowd of Hogwarts students who had gathered. They were the only ones bold enough to follow Hagrid into the pumpkin patch. "It's a Scroot!" Harry exclaimed, recognizing the situation immediately. They had been dealing with Hagrid's new favorite creature for some time. Karkaroff glanced at Harry dismissively, intending to cast a mocking look at Fleur. However, he froze, his gaze fixated on Harry's forehead, where his hair had shifted to reveal the lightning-shaped scar. Karkaroff's eyes widened in disbelief. "Oh, this is serious," Hagrid muttered, clearly distressed. He understood the gravity of the situation, recalling the incident last year when Buckbeak had scratched Draco Malfoy. His voice trembled as he said, "I need to find Professor Dumbledore." However, Atticus stopped him with a calm voice. Fleur's school uniform was torn, a result of the agitated blast-ended Scroot, but her exposed calves showed no severe injuries. If the Scroots were truly dangerous, Hagrid would never have introduced them to the class. Nonetheless, Fleur's skin was unusually red, as if it had been scorched by the recent explosion. "How do you feel?" Atticus asked Fleur calmly, looking up at her. Initially, Fleur had felt shocked, embarrassed, and angry, but now she seemed more composed, a hint of secret delight sparkling in her clear blue eyes. In response to Atticus's concern, she wrinkled her straight nose slightly. "A little pain," Fleur admitted in a soft voice. "It seems we need to visit the campus hospital," Atticus nodded. "Don't worry, Madame Pomfrey is very skilled in her treatments. She will examine you carefully." Atticus Blaine gestured with his fingers, and a green pumpkin detached from its vine, undergoing a complex transformation in midair. Then, he gently levitated Fleur from the ground, placing her onto a stretcher. Noticing the mud on Fleur's skirt, he paused for a moment before removing his robe to cover her. "Professor Karkaroff?" Atticus tilted his head towards Karkaroff, who was almost entranced by Harry's scar. "What?" Karkaroff snapped out of his reverie, reluctantly tearing his gaze away from Harry's forehead. "I need to take Miss Delacour to the Hogwarts infirmary to treat her injuries," Atticus stated calmly. "Could you please inform Madame Maxime?" Karkaroff hesitated, clearly unwilling to leave, but he had no valid reason to stay, especially since he had just volunteered to inform Madame Maxime. "So," Atticus turned to Hagrid, who was still visibly shaken. "I was just showing our guests around the Hogwarts campus. Hagrid, could you continue the tour for me? It would be impolite to abandon them halfway." Hagrid's lips moved, and he turned pale. He knew it was somewhat inappropriate to be outside, but Professor Blaine was already guiding the floating stretcher and the young girl towards the castle. "Right." Atticus, now 50 or 60 feet away, suddenly stopped and called out, "Don't take these children to the Forbidden Forest, Hagrid." With that, he resumed his journey. "It won't be a problem, Hermione?" Harry asked, watching Professor Blaine's retreating figure with concern. "If you're asking about Miss Delacour's injuries, Harry," Hermione replied, her expression equally worried, "I don't think there will be a problem. The blast-ended scroot won't cause particularly serious injuries. I'm sure Madame Pomfrey can heal her in no time. But if you're asking about the implications of this incident..." Hermione sighed. "That depends on Beauxbaton's reaction." After a quiet start to the semester, the Hogwarts infirmary was back to its usual bustling activity. Until the semester's end, Madame Pomfrey would be busy, as no one could stop the imaginative young wizards from getting into mischief. Atticus noticed Neville Longbottom had also made an appearance. Though he bore no visible injuries, his left ear had amusingly relocated to his forehead. "I'm practicing the transformation spell Professor McGonagall assigned," Neville admitted sheepishly in response to Professor Blaine's inquiry, while Fleur and Gabrielle giggled at the sight of Neville's misplaced ear. "What's the matter, Atticus?" Madame Pomfrey emerged from a ward, her expression initially stern. However, upon realizing Atticus wasn't accompanied by a throng of wailing students, she relaxed, taking a deep breath as she approached. "This Beauxbaton's lady," Atticus explained, gesturing to Fleur on the stretcher, sustained a minor leg injury while visiting Hagrid's vegetable garden. "Oh," Madame Pomfrey said, lifting the robe covering Fleur. With a single glance, she understood the situation. Fleur was not the first student to be injured by Hagrid's blast-ended scroot, nor would she be the last. "Don't worry, dear," Madame Pomfrey reassured Fleur with a gentle smile. "A little white blood will heal you right up. And considering you might be a bit shaken, I suggest a glass of chocolate milk with a tranquilizer." "Thank you, ma'am," Fleur replied sweetly, smiling at Madame Pomfrey. She knew her injury wasn't serious and would heal on its own, but she was glad for the chance to spend some time with her classmates and Atticus. "As the culprit," Fleur began, her voice trailing off with a hint of mischief. She shook her hair and smiled brightly, looking at Atticus Blaine with eager eyes. "You're going to stay here, right?" she asked. Atticus knew he couldn't leave. If Madame Maxime arrived later and discovered that he had left Fleur unattended, she would certainly be displeased. After all, even though it was Fleur's own doing, it was his responsibility to ensure her safety. Madame Pomfrey gently pushed Fleur into the room, preparing to tend to her injuries. Suddenly, the beautiful Gabrielle, with eyes as blue as Fleur's, whispered to Atticus in her charmingly broken English, "My sister likes you." "Ah, really?" Atticus replied with a smile. He knelt down to gently straighten Gabrielle's bangs. "Did she tell you that?" Gabrielle shook her head slightly, then nodded emphatically. "My sister talked about you all summer. She said you're more special than any boy she's ever met." Gabrielle pointed to the robe draped over Atticus's arm, her expression serious. "And except for our fath, or she never lets any other boy's clothes cover her." End of this chapter. Chapter 565. Barty Crouch. Fleur's plan to spend some time alone with Atticus Blaine in the school hospital ultimately came to nothing. Madame Maxime quickly arrived at the hospital, and upon learning the full story, she seemed displeased. However, she couldn't express her frustration openly, as Fleur's injury was largely due to her own reckless behavior. Fortunately, Fleur wasn't seriously hurt. She merely lost a few leg hairs. A fall might have caused more damage than this. Nonetheless, the incident left Madame Maxime feeling uneasy. After all, something had gone wrong with Beauxbaton's star player even before the Triwizard Tournament had begun, which was undoubtedly a bad omen. To prevent any further accidents, Madame Maxime stayed by Fleur's bedside. In a show of responsibility, Atticus Blaine remained there as well, until the afternoon when a light rain began to fall, adding to the somber atmosphere in the ward. Next to Fleur's hospital bed, Gabrielle, who had been up since early morning, succumbed to boredom and fell asleep on her sister's lap. As a caring sister, Fleur was concerned that the chilly ward might cause Gabrielle to catch a cold, so she suggested returning to the carriage. The little girl slept soundly and didn't wake despite Fleur and Madame Maxime's gentle attempts to rouse her. She lay cradled in Madame Maxime's arms all the way back to Beauxbaton's carriage. "Would you like to come in and sit down, Mr. Blaine?" Fleur asked, relieved once Gabrielle was safely inside the warm carriage. She adjusted her repaired skirt and looked at the young man standing 10 feet away in the misty rain, her heart pounding. Atticus Blaine gave her a feeling unlike any other. At Beauxbaton, Fleur was never short of admirers, nor was she inexperienced in dating handsome boys. Yet, Atticus Blaine's appearance was merely the most inconspicuous advantage of this mysterious and powerful wizard. The Vila blood in Fleur gave her a keen sense of intuition. She could tell that Atticus had never harbored any romantic thoughts about her, which was simply unbelievable to her and even sparked her ambition. "Thank you for the invitation, Miss Delacour," Atticus replied with a graceful smile, shaking his head. "But entering the living quarters of most ladies is not gentlemanly behavior." This was an expected rejection. Atticus Blaine maintained just the right boundaries with everyone, something Fleur had noticed during her time in Paris. "Well, see you tonight," Fleur said, not too disappointed, and smiled sweetly. "See you tonight, Miss Delacour," Atticus nodded slightly. "I hope you achieve your wish and become a champion of Beauxbatons." As the carriage door closed, Atticus's friendly smile faded, replaced by a hint of sadness. If he wasn't mistaken, he had noticed the affection in Fleur's eyes every time she looked at him. This young witch, in her senior years at Hogwarts, was different from the adolescent girls who sent him love letters out of mere amusement. Fleur seemed genuinely interested in having something more with him, and wasn't shy about expressing her emotions. In truth, he could have ignored it, but he felt that such a dismissive approach was inappropriate. To be honest, there was nothing wrong with Fleur. The issue lay with himself. His identity as a time traveler and his long-term self-isolation made Atticus wary of letting anyone or anything into his heart. He turned his gaze to the ghost ship floating on the slightly rippled black lake, his expression contemplative, cold. The magical world was rife with turbulent undercurrents, and signs were everywhere that the existing structure and system could no longer quell the growing dissatisfaction among the lower echelons. Voldemort was on the brink of returning, and the ancient struggle between the legendary wizard Merlin, the 4 founding giants of Hogwarts, and Herpo the Foul, which had persisted for over 1,000 years, was resurfacing. All these omens pointed to a future far from peaceful. In these uncertain times, Atticus Blaine refused to allow himself any weakness. After calming his thoughts, Atticus surveyed the fog and rain-shrouded campus, but found no sign of Hagrid. It seemed Hagrid was too shaken to be interested in guiding guests around. Before the dinner commenced, Atticus had intended to retreat to his office for a brief rest. He had barely slept the previous night and had risen early that morning. With the evening's dinner promising a fierce debate, Atticus knew he needed to conserve his energy for the challenges ahead. However, his plans for rest were cut short. After barely an hour, a rapid knock on the door jolted him awake. "Oh, sorry, Atticus. I didn't realize you were resting," Professor McGonagall exclaimed, surprised to find Atticus in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Her expression quickly turned stern, as if she disapproved of him napping during the day. "What's the matter?" Atticus asked, trying to shake off his drowsiness. "Is there anything I can do to help, Professor?" "Someone from the Ministry of Magic is here, Atticus. It's Barty Crouch from the Department of International Magical Cooperation. He's attending tonight's dinner," Professor McGonagall explained, her tone urging him to action. "You've worked with him before, so Albus would like you to entertain him." "Where are they?" Atticus inquired. "Just down there," Professor McGonagall replied curtly, "in the small room behind the auditorium." With Professor McGonagall's insistence, Atticus had little time to tidy up. He quickly changed and headed out, attempting to smooth his hair as he descended the stairs. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall filled him in on the rumor circulating the school that Hagrid had attacked a Beauxbatons student. This misunderstanding had infuriated Professor McGonagall, who was deeply concerned about the school's reputation, and she didn't hesitate to express her displeasure to Atticus. "You know Hagrid's penchant for unusual creatures, yet you still took them there, Atticus," she scolded, her face pale with anger. "With so many eyes on Hogwarts, imagine what the Daily Prophet would say if they thought we were conspiring against Beauxbatons champions." By the time Atticus entered the small room behind the auditorium, he was feeling a bit impatient. Despite his status and strength, Professor McGonagall was the only one at Hogwarts, and perhaps in the entire wizarding world, who dared to treat him as if he were still an underage wizard. Inside, Ludo Bagman was absent, but Dumbledore and Barty Crouch were engaged in conversation by the fire. The flames cast a warm glow, and Crouch's stooped posture suggested fatigue, a stark contrast to his usual upright demeanor. "Ah, there you are, Atticus," Dumbledore greeted him with a calm smile. Atticus turned his attention to Crouch, who also turned to face him. Despite their differing allegiances, Atticus had worked with Crouch for over 2 months in Paris and had come to admire certain qualities in the man. But, as Atticus Blaine met Barty Crouch's intense gaze, he hesitated for a moment, his hand suspended in midair. The smile on his lips wavered, almost slipping away. Fortunately, he quickly regained his composure, ensuring no hint of unease showed. "How are you, Barty?" Atticus inquired, his voice carrying a deep, resonant tone. "I heard you personally inspected those fire dragon nature reserves." Dumbledore's blue eyes flickered momentarily as he observed Atticus, maintaining his serene smile. "You should join us, Atticus. Thanks to Barty, our first test can proceed as planned." End of this chapter. Chapter 566. Barrier Old Batty appeared frail, as if he had just recovered from a severe illness. He seemed particularly sensitive to the cold. After casting an impatient glance at Atticus Blaine, he quickly averted his gaze, focusing intently on the flames in the fireplace, as if he wished to merge with them. "What's wrong?" Atticus asked calmly, positioning himself on the opposite side of Barty Crouch, with Dumbledore standing beside him. "What happened?" "Nothing," Barty replied, his tone as curt as his expression. He shifted his shoulders, inching closer to the warmth of the fireplace. "I've been traveling these past few days, first to Sweden, then Wales, and China. Everything was proceeding smoothly. The dragon reserves in these regions had already selected opponents for the warriors. But when it came to the Hungarian horntail, things went awry. The staff there wanted the creature to acclimate to its cage, but they overlooked the fact that this is the time when it least wants human interaction." Barty reluctantly showed Atticus the burn marks on his lower forearm. "A lot of people nearly lost their lives. I spent 2 full days at St. Mungo's, but the healer wouldn't discharge me. She insisted I stay in bed for another week. Oh, that's simply not feasible." Weatherby from the ministry, who was sent here, is indeed passionate about his work. Frankly, he's a bit too enthusiastic, but he's young and inexperienced. With the warrior selection underway, I can't afford to leave him unsupervised. Barty's words trailed off, as if he had explained everything. You do look like you need some rest, Barty, Dumbledore said with concern. Oh, yes, Barty unexpectedly agreed with Dumbledore. He continued to stare at the flames. If possible, Dumbledore, and Atticus, I'd like to take a quiet moment before the banquet this evening. Once the warrior selection concludes, I must return to the ministry. So many matters await my attention. Barty sighed, closing his eyes as if utterly spent. His arms rested on the fireplace's edge, as if he might drift into sleep at any moment. Let's give Barty some space, Headmaster Dumbledore, Atticus suggested. Thank you so much, Atticus, Barty replied, his voice dry. I do need some private space. I must admit, the advice from the healer at St. Mungo's holds some truth. My arm is aching. The room's walls were adorned with portraits, some figures gazing at the dedicated Barty Crouch with admiration. If you need anything, Barty, Dumbledore said before leaving, you can ask the portraits to report to me at any time. They can always find me. The auditorium was mostly empty, but a crowd of young wizards gathered in the foyer, excitedly pointing at the blue and white flames emanating from the goblet of fire. They didn't notice Professor Dumbledore and Professor Blaine quietly exiting the auditorium. The light rain had darkened the sky prematurely. With dinner approaching, Dumbledore and Atticus chose not to go upstairs. Instead, they exited through a small door on the other side, making their way to a secluded courtyard surrounded by several castle walls. The dark green lawn, rather than appearing refreshed by the rain, had turned an eerie black. In the courtyard's center, an old spruce tree stood encircled by a flower bed of warm stones. Its leaves rustled ominously under the rain's assault. Few visited this old courtyard, but now only Dumbledore and Atticus were present. Did Voldemort make a move? Atticus inquired. Atticus Blaine's eyes wandered around the courtyard before he lifted his gaze to the astronomy tower, the tallest structure at Hogwarts. Though he was asking questions, his tone remained calm. I think so, he said. Dumbledore stroked his beard, his deep and penetrating gaze seeming to pierce through the dark clouds above. A long silence enveloped both Dumbledore and Atticus as they pondered the issue quietly. Why would Voldemort still want to control Barty Crouch when he already had someone working for him within Hogwarts? Crouch was no ordinary person. He was the Second-in-Command at the British Ministry of Magic, a position of significant sensitivity. If it were discovered that he was under the Imperious Curse, it would certainly not be advantageous for Voldemort in his current situation. Before regaining his full power, Voldemort was cautious about actions that might expose him. Yet, he not only took this risk, but also exposed Crouch to both Dumbledore and Atticus. It was indeed puzzling. Atticus had some vague suspicions, but they were not fully formed. When it came to understanding Voldemort, Dumbledore was undoubtedly more knowledgeable. He had personally recruited Tom Riddle into Hogwarts and had almost witnessed firsthand the transformation of the domineering and peculiar boy from the orphanage into the Dark Lord, whose name most dared not speak. Tom chose to target old Barty, not to seize control of the Ministry of Magic, Dumbledore mused. Oh, he might attempt that eventually, but not now. He noticed a change in Atticus's demeanor and continued before Atticus could question him. My guess is, and you and I both know, Atticus, that something unexpected will occur at the Halloween feast in an hour. This is the result of Tom's meticulous planning, yet it is predictable. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang would certainly not be pleased to see Hogwarts with 2 Triwizard Tournament champions. Of course, if Hogwarts had only one champion, and he was an underage wizard, Madame Maxime and Professor Karkaroff might not object strongly. I understand what you mean, Atticus nodded. You believe Voldemort is concerned that these 2 schools will strongly oppose the selection results. Therefore, he needs a wizard with influence to speak on his behalf. Atticus frowned. It's surprising that he is so cautious and can consider such intricate issues. I thought that after losing most of his soul, his mind would be less sharp. Atticus was clearly joking, but if Dumbledore's theory was correct, Voldemort had indeed surprised him. Whether Dumbledore's hypothesis was accurate would soon be revealed by Barty's actions that night. He had clearly come to Hogwarts with a purpose, otherwise he could have simply feigned illness at St. Mungo's. The real concern lay elsewhere. If Voldemort controlled Barty Crouch merely to ensure his inclusion in the Triwizard Tournament, What would he do once that goal was achieved? Would he kill old Barty to make a statement, or use him as a pawn within the Ministry of Magic? Regardless of the outcome, neither Dumbledore nor Atticus could stand by idly, yet intervening now would be unwise. Voldemort had finally extended a tendril from the shadows, and this was his most vulnerable moment. Any indication that he had been discovered would drive him back into hiding. Had Voldemort been lurking in Barty Crouch's house since leaving Little Hangleton? Upon reflection, Atticus found it unlikely. As a prominent official of the British Ministry of Magic, Barty Crouch's home was frequently visited, making it an uncomfortable place for Voldemort to remain hidden, to stay there. "I'll ask Sirius to keep a closer eye on Barty's recent activities," Atticus Blaine said after a long pause. "Of course, I'll also instruct Sirius and Barty Crouch to maintain their distance from each other." Dumbledore pondered for a moment, then sighed and nodded in agreement. In the void, the wind howled fiercely, reminiscent of a war horn. Standing in the courtyard, Dumbledore and Atticus faced the encroaching darkness. They seemed to form a barrier, separating the shadowy courtyard from the bright lights beyond, which were filled with a sense of urgency and joy. The auditorium stood isolated. End of this chapter. Chapter 567, Suffering. The Halloween dinner at Hogwarts has always been a grand affair, unmatched by any other feast throughout the year. This particular dinner was even more special due to the unveiling of the Triwizard Tournament warrior candidates, adding a mix of anticipation and anxiety to the evening. The dinner was scheduled to begin at 6 o'clock, but by 4, eager young wizards were already making their way downstairs. Some had even lingered in the foyer all day, hoping to catch a glimpse of those who had cast their votes into the Goblet of Fire. By 5:30, darkness had settled over the castle, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered the Great Hall together. The day had started with the promise of being enjoyable, as they had planned to spend it with Hagrid, hoping to glean some information about the Triwizard Tournament from him. However, a morning mishap involving a Beauxbaton student had thrown their plans into disarray. The trio had accompanied Hagrid as he showed the Durmstrang and Beauxbaton students around the Hogwarts grounds. Hagrid was flustered by Fleur's injury and seemed at a loss, leaving Harry, Ron, and Hermione to lead the tour. Unfortunately, they lacked Professor Atticus Blaine's knack for impressing visitors. In an effort to showcase something worthwhile, they even persuaded Professor Sprout to open the greenhouse filled with magical plants. Yet, this failed to satisfy the guests, and complaints and ridicule were constant, with many abandoning the tour halfway through. Hermione, exasperated, found herself in a heated argument with some of the critical Beauxbaton's witches. On the brighter side, Victor Crumb's presence was a pleasant surprise. Despite being unwell, he stayed until the end of the tour, earning the trio's admiration. Ron was thrilled to receive an autograph from him. They had lunch at Hagrid's, where he served a large pot of steak stew. However, Hermione's discovery of a large claw in her portion dampened their appetites. In the afternoon, Hermione attempted to teach Dom and Ron wizard chess, believing it was important for Dom to learn some recreational skills. However, Dom's frequent losses led to dramatic reactions, including apologizing tearfully to Hermione and punishing himself by sticking his head into Hagrid's furnace. "Honestly, Hermione, he's not cut out for this. Even Neville is better," Ron remarked after another victory, shrugging as Hermione glared at him. Meanwhile, Harry tried to reassure Hagrid that Professor Blaine would handle the situation with the blast-ended Scroots and that the Ministry of Magic wouldn't execute them. Despite Harry's efforts, Hagrid remained despondent. Eventually, even Harry felt at a loss. "Just apologize, Hagrid," Harry suggested with a sigh. "If the headmistress of Beauxbatons forgives you, there's no reason for the Ministry to act rashly." "Oh, that's a brilliant idea," Hagrid exclaimed, his spirits lifting. He washed his hair with a perfume that smelled more like insect repellent and eagerly headed to the Beauxbatons' carriage, leaving the trio behind. "Does Hagrid think he can stun the headmistress with his scent and earn forgiveness?" Ron mused as they climbed the last step into the hall. "Honestly, he shouldn't worry so much." Raised, it seemed the answer was now clear. Professor Atticus Blaine, with his usual calm demeanor, rose from his seat at the staff table. The anticipation in the room was palpable, and Hermione couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment that it wasn't Professor Dumbledore making the announcement. The golden auditorium, bathed in the warm glow of thousands of floating candles, was packed to the brim. The students' eyes were fixed on Professor Blaine, who was about to reveal the much-anticipated results of the Goblet of Fire. Hermione, Harry, and Ron had managed to find seats amidst the bustling crowd, and Hermione had already noticed that Fred and George's chins were smooth once more. "I suppose you've learned your lesson, haven't you?" Hermione teased, raising an eyebrow and smiling at the twin. Fred, not one to back down easily, retorted, "Oh, I think those who challenge the rules are the real warriors, you nosy know-it-all." Meanwhile, Harry observed the staff table and noticed an additional presence. Alongside Ludo Bagman, who had been at the Triwizard Tournament's opening ceremony, was Barty Crouch. However, Crouch appeared unwell and drained of energy. "I think he should realize he can't manage without Winky's help," Hermione remarked, her tone lacking sympathy. "He should feel remorseful for his actions and seek Winky's forgiveness." Hermione's opinion was wishful thinking. The formidable director of the Department of International Magical Cooperation was unlikely to apologize to a house elf. If Barty Crouch desired, he could easily acquire 100 house elves to serve him. "I wonder who will become the champion of Hogwarts," Harry mused, steering the conversation away from house elves, knowing it was a sensitive topic for Hermione. "I really hope it's Angelina," Fred chimed in immediately. Angelina was the only senior Gryffindor they knew who had entered her name into the Goblet of Fire, though there were undoubtedly others who had done so privately. "Me too," Hermione agreed, her attention now fully on the topic. She waved to Angelina, who sat a few seats away, her fists clenched and her usually tanned skin appearing a shade paler. "I hope you become the Hogwarts champion, Angelina." Since their last discussion about love with Professor Blaine in the library, Hermione and Angelina had grown closer. "Oh, thank you," Angelina replied, turning to Hermione with a nervous smile. The Halloween dinner seemed to drag on longer than usual. Perhaps it was because there had been banquet for 2 consecutive days, and the students weren't as enthusiastic about the lavish dishes as they typically were. The atmosphere in the auditorium was tense, with students frequently glancing towards the staff table, eager for the announcement. "Who do you think will announce the results?" Neville suddenly asked, sparking a lively debate among the students. "Professor Dumbledore or Professor Blaine, it's always one of them," Ron speculated, his mouth full of pudding. The discussion helped pass the time, which felt interminable. Finally, the golden plates returned to their pristine state, and the chatter in the auditorium grew louder. Professor Blaine stood up, and the room fell silent in anticipation. Hermione sighed, slightly disappointed that it wasn't Dumbledore, but eager to hear the results nonetheless. She had just raised her hand, showing her support for Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, who was expected to reveal the answer to everyone on this solemn occasion. The auditorium fell silent immediately. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on Professor Atticus Blaine. At the faculty table, Professor Karkaroff and Madame Maxime appeared as anxious and expectant as everyone else. Ludo Bagman was grinning and winking at students from various schools, while Crouch seemed disinterested, as if he couldn't wait to leave. "Everyone," Professor Blaine began, stepping out from behind Professor Snape. He moved to the open space between the staff table and the student tables near the square table where the Goblet of Fire was placed. With a smile, he addressed the audience. "This marks the end of our torturous and uncomfortable dinner. Now, it's time to reveal the answer for both you and myself." End of this chapter. Chapter 568, The Four Warriors. As Atticus Blaine surveyed the eager and expectant faces below, he allowed himself a slight smile. "I would like to extend my congratulations in advance to the 3 young wizards chosen as champions by the Goblet of Fire," he announced. "This Triwizard Tournament is the first of its kind in centuries. Whether or not it continues in the future, your names will be etched in history, and your performances will be celebrated." The prospect of being remembered by history made many in the audience catch their breath. Atticus continued, his tone more solemn. "To those young wizards who bravely entered but were not selected by the Goblet of Fire, remember this. In our lives, both long and short, we face many challenges. Overcoming these is far more glorious than merely participating in a competition. So whether chosen or not, I urge you to remain optimistic. Face life with a positive attitude and do not neglect or give up on yourself because of this. Dumbledore, smiling, led the applause, followed by Professor McGonagall, who wiped her eyes and clapped vigorously. The applause, initially sparse, grew louder and more enthusiastic until even the candles suspended in mid-air seemed to flicker in response to the strong wind of approval. "What a wise statement," Dumbledore remarked sensibly to Professor Snape, seated on his right. As expected, Snape's expression darkened at the comment. Atticus's words had a calming effect on many young wizards who had been anxious about the outcome. "Now, the Goblet of Fire is about to make its decision," Atticus announced, raising his hands to quiet the applause. "In about a minute, the names of the champions will be revealed. When your name is called, please proceed to the front of the auditorium, walk along the staff table, and enter the next room." He gestured to the room where Barty had been earlier, where you will receive preliminary guidance. With a flourish of his wand, Atticus extinguished all the candles except those in the jack-o'-lanterns. The auditorium was plunged into semi-darkness, with the Goblet of Fire glowing brightly, drawing every eye to it. Atticus stood beside the goblet, watching the young wizards below as they held their breath, waiting for the revelation. Even Fleur, usually confident, found herself nervous at this moment. "It's coming!" someone shouted among the students. Atticus, already aware, turned his gaze to the red flames. His hand rose, drawing everyone's attention away from the flames as sparks crackled and danced in the cup. "The champion for Durmstrang is—" Atticus unfolded the parchment, smiling as he read the name before anyone else. In a clear, powerful voice, he announced, "Victor Krum." The restrained emotions erupted into cheers. Except for a few disappointed Durmstrang students, every young wizard was shouting with excitement, even if they weren't sure why. "Not surprising at all," Ron yelled, while Hermione stood up with Harry, cheering. Though she didn't idolize Krum's Quidditch fame like Ron and Harry, she still held a favorable impression of him. At the Quidditch final, before Professor Atticus Blaine arrived, it was Victor Krum who accepted her commission and invited Mr. Moore Weasley to the box to assist. In that tense situation, Krum's willingness to help a group of ordinary people was a testament to his kindness and courage. "Excellent, Victor." Professor Karkaroff's voice boomed like a bell. Despite the loud applause in the auditorium, his voice was unmistakable. "I knew you were destined to be a warrior." Victor Krum, however, was far less enthusiastic than his professor. He rose listlessly from Draco's side and walked slowly towards the room Atticus had mentioned earlier. As he passed by Atticus, he nodded respectfully, and Atticus returned the gesture with a smile. "This guy is much more likable than Karkaroff," Atticus thought. The applause gradually subsided, and everyone's attention returned to the Goblet of Fire. Atticus deftly caught the second piece of parchment ejected from the red flame. Without even opening it, he knew whose name was on it, as the parchment was torn from his own notebook. "The champion of Beauxbaton," he announced. The moment their eyes met, Fleur Delacour knew her name was about to echo through the auditorium. When it did, spoken by the man she admired, it caused a stir. Fleur shook her silver hair briskly and stood up gracefully. As she passed Atticus, she slowed her steps. "Thank you," Fleur said, her smile as radiant as a flower. "I wish you well, Miss Delacour," Atticus replied with a gentlemanly nod and smile. As before, the Beauxbaton students who hadn't been chosen applauded warmly for Fleur, joined by many Hogwarts students. However, the congratulations from the girls were noticeably fewer this time. The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation. Even the heads of the four major Hogwarts houses, Minerva McGonagall, Phileas Flitwick, Pomona Sprout, and Severus Snape, who usually observed events with a detached demeanor, cast expectant glances at the third piece of parchment in Atticus's hand. The younger wizards below were tense, many clenching their fists as if they were betting everything on a final gamble. Atticus opened the parchment with precision. As the name came into view, a sincere smile spread across his face. "So," he announced, looking at the tall, handsome young man at the Hufflepuff table, "you can cheer for Mr. Grad, Cedric Diggory." At the Gryffindor table, Angelina sighed in disappointment, while Ron's loud protest was drowned out by the deafening cheers from the adjacent table. Every Hufflepuff was jumping, screaming, and stamping their feet in celebration. Harry saw his classmates from Hufflepuff's physical education class, Hannah, Ernie, Justin, Susan, and Megan, leaving their seats to rush to Cedric's side, cheering for him with high-pitched enthusiasm. To be honest, Harry felt a twinge of envy. He had only experienced such popularity once, last year, when he defeated Malfoy in the Quidditch final and secured the championship for Gryffindor. Subconsciously, Harry glanced at Malfoy and the Slytherin students around him. As expected, they regarded Cedric with disdain, as if he were merely a lucky clown. Seeing this, Harry felt a bit better. He smiled and clapped his hands vigorously. After all, Cedric was about to represent Hogwarts against Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, and he was also a classmate in Professor Blaine's physical education class. In the center of the storm, Cedric was a bit overwhelmed. He had longed for this moment, and now that his dream had come true, he was. Atticus Blaine felt a bit lost. Subconsciously, his gaze drifted past the faces in front of him and settled on Raven. At the Ravenclaw table, he noticed a delicate and beautiful girl with flushed cheeks and eyes sparkling with excitement as she looked at him. Cedric's heart skipped a beat, and his handsome face turned a deep shade of red. "Oh, congratulations, Pomona!" The disappointment on Professor McGonagall's face lasted less than a second before she turned to congratulate an overjoyed Professor Sprout. The other colleagues at the table followed suit. At that moment, it seemed only two people at Hogwarts remained calm, Albus Dumbledore and Atticus Blaine. "Great," Atticus remarked, glancing calmly at Harry, who was applauding enthusiastically along with his classmates. Atticus did not take his eyes off the Goblet of Fire, smiling contentedly. "All right, now our 3 champions have been selected. I know you will place your unwavering trust in the champions of your respective schools and support them wholeheartedly. I also believe our 3 champions will make us proud." Suddenly, as if someone had cast a silencing spell, the Goblet of Fire erupted with red flames once more, capturing everyone's astonished attention. A long tongue of fire shot into the air, holding up another piece of parchment. Harry noticed the same shock on Professor Blaine's face as everyone else. Instinctively, he took the parchment, frowning as he raised it high. But when Professor Blaine read the contents, surprise vanished instantly. Professor Blaine did not speak. Instead, he turned to look at the staff table, leaving the young wizards without a chance to observe his expression. Atticus met Dumbledore's blue eyes directly. In the prolonged silence, their gazes locked in mid-air, drawing the attention of everyone present. The silence felt interminable, a thought that crossed more than one mind. Finally, Professor Dumbledore seemed to grasp the message conveyed by Professor Blaine. He blinked his blue eyes behind his half-moon glasses and slowly leaned back in his chair from his previously upright posture. Professor Blaine turned back, his face pale yet composed in the blue-white firelight. He raised the 4th piece of parchment he had retrieved from the Goblet of Fire, and in the next moment, a name echoed through the auditorium. Hermione Granger. End of this chapter. Chapter 569. I didn't. It wasn't me. Hermione sat there, realizing that everyone in the auditorium had turned their heads to look at her. This was unexpected, as she wasn't particularly well known among the other grades. Many students didn't even know who Hermione Granger was, but after some inquiries, their eyes inevitably landed on her due to her association with the famous Harry Potter. Hermione was stunned, her mouth slightly agape, her pure brown eyes misty. Her thin body trembled slightly under the scrutiny of countless eyes, as if she were waking from a deep dream, her consciousness struggling to regain control over her body. There was no applause, only a buzzing sound that began to fill the auditorium, like the hum of countless angry bees. Some students even stood up to get a better look at Hermione Granger, but she remained frozen in her seat, as if under a petrification spell. Professor McGonagall rose from her seat and quickly approached Professor Dumbledore. Her face was grave as she whispered urgently, while Dumbledore listened intently, a slight frown on his face. Ludo Bagman and Professor Karkaroff also stood, seemingly believing that young Professor Blaine had made an inappropriate joke. They hurried around the table to confront Professor Blaine, craning their necks to peer at the piece of paper he held. Time seemed to crawl forward in despair, and Hermione's body trembled more violently, yet this allowed her to regain some movement. She turned her head to look at Harry and Ron, and at every face at the Gryffindor table. Her eyes welled with tears. It was a small comfort that Harry's face showed only confusion. Hermione had never seen Ron look so unfamiliar. He stared at her, every line on his face etched with anger. Fred, George, Ginny, they all looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Neville, Siamus, Dean, Alia, and Katie gazed at her in shock, but the most unbearable were the eyes of Patil, Lavender, and Angelina. Hermione's gaze flickered over them briefly, unable to endure the resentment and the sense that they saw her as a mere clown who had somehow escaped punishment. "I didn't." Hermione's voice cracked with emotion. The situation felt utterly hopeless. She remembered her early days at Hogwarts, when she worked hard to cover up her insecurities about her Muggle origins. Her diligence had earned her the favor of many professors and some classmates, but most still ignored her, viewing her as a troublemaker. It was the friendship with Harry and Ron that had saved her from that confusion. Now, it seemed they were her only allies. "I didn't," Hermione repeated, her thin shoulders shaking. If she hadn't been in the auditorium, under the gaze of so many, she might have broken down in tears at her desk. Thankfully, Harry took a deep breath. Though his mind was still muddled, his gaze on Hermione was resolute. Ron's mouth moved slightly, the lines of anger on his face softening, though his eyes flickered uncertainly. Karkaroff's eyes seemed to bore into the note in Atticus Blaine's hand. Blaine tossed the note aside, stepped forward, and looked beyond the Gryffindor table. He repeated, "Hermione Granger, come on, come to that door." "Go." Harry's voice was heavy with anger. He gently patted Hermione's arm, urging her forward. The sensation in Atticus Blaine's palm was electric, causing Hermione's body to tremble violently. "Go, Hermione," urged Neville, his eyes shifting from shock to concern. The silent support from a few around her finally gave Hermione the courage she needed. She stood up shakily, her foot catching on the hem of her robes, causing her to stumble slightly. She still couldn't bring herself to look at the Hufflepuff table beside her. Although most of the Gryffindors gazed at her in surprise, their looks were gentle compared to the resentment from Hufflepuff. Hermione understood why Hufflepuff harbored such feelings towards her. It was a matter that required no contemplation. As Hermione walked down the passage between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables, the path seemed interminably long, and the guest of honor's seat appeared perpetually distant. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, each gaze like a piercing searchlight. The buzzing chatter grew louder, and it felt like an eternity before she finally reached Professor Blaine. He was the only person she dared to observe, and he was indeed watching her. Unlike her classmates, his expression held no surprise, which was unsurprising in itself. It seemed nothing could ever astonish Professor Blaine. To Hermione's relief, he didn't view her as a mischievous little wizard. Instead, he looked at her with his usual demeanor, even with a hint of concern in his eyes. At that moment, Hermione was particularly attuned to this emotion. "Not me, Professor," she cried out, her voice breaking. Perhaps it was this concern that made her feel so vulnerable. Her unsteady steps halted abruptly. "It's okay, Miss Granger," Atticus reassured her, patting her shoulder gently. He turned to Professor McGonagall, who stood beside Dumbledore, her expression one of unbearable concern. His voice was calm and steady. "Minerva, I believe Miss Granger could use some assistance. Would you kindly accompany her to the small room?" Without hesitation, Professor McGonagall left Dumbledore's side, circled the table, and approached Hermione with purpose. Hermione feared a reprimand, knowing how much Professor McGonagall valued Gryffindor's reputation. The moment the Goblet of Fire had revealed her name, both Gryffindor and Hogwarts had been thrust into disrepute. "Come, Miss Granger," Professor McGonagall said, her voice gentler than Hermione had ever heard. With an arm around Hermione's shoulders, she quickly led her out of sight. Atticus watched the young witch, destined to endure much, disappear into the room at the side of the auditorium. Then, he turned his gaze to Dumbledore at the staff table. A hint of coldness flickered in Dumbledore's blue eyes as he slowly stood, meeting Atticus's gaze. Most of the staff remained in shock, though Professor Snape appeared slightly smug, while Barty Crouch, with his stern demeanor, seemed detached from the unfolding events. A soft sound, audible only to those near the faculty table, drew Atticus's attention to Madame Maxime. She struggled to contain her anger, her palm leaving cracks on the tabletop. "As you can see," Atticus addressed the students, pointing to the goblet of fire's dwindling blue and white flames, "the selection of champions has concluded. Now, the heads of the male and female student unions and the prefects of each house will escort your classmates back to their dormitories immediately. I do not wish to see anyone wandering the castle tonight in defiance of school rules." The murmurs of discontent below erupted into a clamor, with many demanding an explanation. In front of the faculty table, Professor Blaine's presence seemed to loom larger, casting a heavy pressure that was almost palpable. The air was filled with the sound of rolling thunder, echoing in all directions. The young wizards fell silent, leaving their seats obediently and making their way towards the foyer in an orderly fashion. Even those closest to Atticus Blaine felt the intensity of his aura. Professor Karkaroff and Ludo Bagman, who was inexplicably excited, were caught off guard by the force emanating from Atticus. It was as if they had been struck by a freezing spell, leaving them momentarily stunned and their teeth chattering. "Let's get this straight," Atticus said calmly, gesturing towards Professor Karkaroff and the others at the faculty table. His voice carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. End of this chapter. Chapter 570. The Argument. Atticus Blaine and Dumbledore swiftly entered the room, followed closely by Madame Maxime, Professor Karkaroff, and two senior officials from the Ministry of Magic. Professor Snape was the second to last to enter, and Professor Moody, who was the last, used his magical eye to scan the empty auditorium before finally closing the door. The restless portraits on the walls immediately fell silent as the group entered, each one watching curiously, eager to learn how this bizarre incident would be handled so they could later boast to their portrait friends. Atticus noticed Hermione still in Professor McGonagall's arms. Despite the strong flames in the fireplace, Hermione's thin shoulders continued to tremble slightly. Fleur, Krum, and Cedric had evidently been informed of the situation by Professor McGonagall, and Atticus could sense the anger hidden in Fleur's furrowed brow. Everyone seemed deep in thought, except for Ludo Bagman, whose intrigued expression as he looked at Hermione stood out among the group. Atticus glanced at him, immediately discerning his intentions. "Madame Maxime." Fleur expected Atticus to provide an explanation, but as he entered the room, he merely gave her a cursory glance, which only fueled her anger. She shook her hair fiercely and strode towards her headmistress. "The professor told us that the little girl was also chosen as a champion." Professor McGonagall pursed her lips, remaining silent. Madame Maxime straightened her tall frame, her elegant head brushing against the chandelier filled with candles. Her large chest, clad in black satin, heaved with emotion. "What does this mean, Dumbledore?" Her eyes darted between Dumbledore and Blaine, ultimately settling on Dumbledore. Karkaroff, however, chose the opposite, a cold smile playing on his lips as he looked at Atticus, though he avoided meeting his eyes due to the unsettling moment they shared outside. "I'd like to know that too, Blaine," Karkaroff said, moving towards Krum, who was watching Atticus with confusion. "Can Hogwarts have two champions? I don't recall anyone mentioning that the host school could have two champions. Unless, of course, Blaine, you've decided to broadcast the Triwizard Tournament to the public and change the rules on a whim." "This is impossible," Ludo interjected with a smile. "It's never been a tradition, but I must say, Blaine's decision to broadcast the tournament live was a stroke of genius, right, Barty?" Barty Crouch, who had moved to the fireplace upon entering, stood warming himself by the fire. His expression was obscured in the shadows, and he responded to Ludo's question with a non-committal hum. "This is not what we are discussing now," Madame Maxime asserted firmly. "Hogwarts cannot have two champions. This is extremely unfair unless this girl is removed from the competition." Hermione, curled up in Professor McGonagall's arms, bit her lip, her eyes filled with longing as she looked at Professor Dumbledore and Atticus Blaine. Atticus understood that Hermione was not pleading for him to help her retain her status as a champion, but quite the opposite. Yet, he knew he couldn't give Hermione the answers she desired. "I think we both know that's unrealistic, ma'am," Atticus said to Madame Maxime, his gaze encompassing everyone in the room. They all noticed a change in the lavender hue of Blaine's eyes, as if two golden flames had replaced the centers of his pupils. Simultaneously, the room grew warmer, a heat that the wall-mounted fireplace alone could not provide. Professor Moody, leaning against the wall, observed the unfolding scene with keen interest. As the door creaked open, Barty Cratchit, standing by the fireplace, shifted his shoulders unconsciously. The consequences of violating the Goblet of Fire contract are severe enough to destroy Miss Hermione Granger's magical abilities. I don't believe anyone here has the authority to make such a decision. At the mention of her magical talents being stripped away, Hermione's cheeks and lips turned ghostly pale, tears still clinging to the corners of her eyes. "It's not our fault, Blaine." Karkaroff's eyes grew colder, indifferent to the despair his words inflicted on Hermione. He turned to Dumbledore, saying, "From what we understand, Dumbledore, your age line should prevent underage competitors. Otherwise, we would have brought more candidates from our school." Dumbledore entered the room, his gaze never leaving Hermione's eyes, as if he were peering into her very soul. Karkaroff's question did not faze him. He asked calmly, "Are you certain you didn't submit your name to the Goblet of Fire, Hermione?" "I didn't, Professor Dumbledore," Hermione replied, her voice still trembling. She had few direct interactions with Dumbledore, the last being when he hinted at using a time-turner to capture Peter. She still didn't understand why this was happening to her, but she knew that Professor Dumbledore and Professor Blaine were her best hopes for clearing her name. "I spent the entire day with Harry and Ron. I didn't do it." "Did you ask any older students to submit your name for you?" Dumbledore continued. Hermione was momentarily stunned, realizing how easily she could have bypassed the age line, but she quickly shook her head vehemently. "She's obviously lying," Karkaroff sneered, casting a sideways glance at Hermione. "If you knew Miss Hermione Granger well enough." Professor McGonagall's chest heaved with indignation. She no longer cared about maintaining the image of Hogwarts or Gryffindor. She glared at Karkaroff, her voice filled with anger. "You would know that Miss Granger is the finest young witch in Gryffindor. She is intelligent, diligent, and humble. Her grades are the best in her year. Every professor who has taught her at Hogwarts can vouch for her integrity. Professor Karkaroff, I absolutely believe Miss Granger is not lying." "Those are two separate issues," Madame Maxime interjected, looking at Hermione with a mix of surprise and skepticism. "Thank you." Karkaroff nodded at Madame Maxime, then turned to Professor McGonagall, his indifferent smile gone. "Achievements mean nothing. Perhaps her good grades are as deceitful as her becoming a champion." "Do you think we're all fools, Karkaroff?" To Atticus Blaine's surprise, Snape, leaning against the wall, defended Hermione with a lazy drawl. "I think we need to reach a consensus before proceeding." Atticus Blaine stood up, addressing the room. "The Goblet of Fire is a powerful magical artifact with a keen sense of discernment. If Miss Granger merely asked someone to submit her name, the goblet would have selected only 3 champions. It wouldn't make such a basic error as choosing 4 unless it was tampered with. The magic required to interfere with the goblet is formidable, and, if I may say so, only a few in this room might possess such capability. Madame Maxime, Professor Karkaroff, surely you agree that Hermione Granger lacks the influence to persuade any of us to help her cheat?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Madame Maxime, Professor Karkaroff, and the others exchanged glances, each contemplating the implications of Blaine's words. The legal warriors were intently observing several Hogwarts faculty members gathered in the room. Atticus Blaine had presented a compelling argument to prove the innocence of the young witch, inadvertently caught up in the incident. Hermione's face finally regained some color, her emotions having been on a roller coaster after Karkaroff's earlier assessment. She realized she had at last been cleared of the unjust suspicion. Accusing Severus of aiding this bothersome young witch in cheating was clearly inappropriate. Moody was not someone to provoke lightly, and to accuse Blaine, Dumbledore, or the equally esteemed Minerva McGonagall of assisting students in cheating would undoubtedly make one appear deranged. Karkaroff's dim yellow eyes darted in their sockets almost as rapidly as Moody's magical eye. After a moment of reluctance, He turned to the two senior officials from the British Ministry of Magic. His voice shifted from stiff and indifferent to oily and ingratiating. "Mr. Crouch and Mr. Bagman, you two are our impartial judges. Surely, you must agree that this situation is highly inappropriate, don't you?" End of this chapter. Chapter 571, Conclusion. Karkaroff posed a question to two senior officials from the British Ministry of Magic. Bagman, eager to share his thoughts, was momentarily silenced when he caught sight of Atticus Blaine's impassive face. Instead, he turned his attention to Barty Crouch, who stood outside the circle of fire, his face half obscured by shadow. The darkness made him appear older, almost skeletal. When he finally spoke, his voice was as rigid as ever. "Atticus is right. Hermione Granger has no other choice. We must adhere to the Charter, which clearly states that anyone whose name emerges from the Goblet of Fire must participate in the competition." "That's it!" Ludo Bagman exclaimed, smiling as he glanced at Karkaroff and Madame Maxime, as if the issue had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. "If it must be this way," Karkaroff echoed, mimicking Crouch's stiff tone. The smile vanished from his face, and veins bulged on his clenched fists. "You must reignite the Goblet of Fire and continue adding names until there are 2 champions from each school. This is only fair, Blaine." "But Karkaroff, I'm afraid that won't work," Bagman interjected awkwardly, as neither Atticus nor Dumbledore offered their opinions. "The Goblet of Fire has just been extinguished. It won't be relit until the next tournament." A moment of silence followed. Fleur turned her gaze to Atticus, who appeared solemn, while Victor looked at Hermione with admiration. He had grown fond of the young witch from Hogwarts, especially after witnessing her bravery during the World Cup final, where she had faced a dark wizard far more powerful than herself. Meanwhile, Cedric Diggory, the true Hogwarts champion, seemed somewhat lost, as if everyone had forgotten about him. "Durmstrang will never participate in the next Tri-Wizard tournament," Karkaroff fumed. "After all the meetings and negotiations, I never imagined something like this would happen again. I just want to leave right now." "The door to Hogwarts is always open, Karkaroff. You can leave at any time, but your champion must stay," Atticus replied coldly. "Just like Miss Granger, I cannot stand by and watch Mr. Crumb become a squib due to the Goblet of Fire's contract backlash." Karkaroff's face flushed with anger. He glared at Atticus and said through gritted teeth, "You're threatening me, Blaine. I swear I'll report this to the Federation. Don't think that being vice president makes you immune to consequences for your mistakes." "Empty threats, Karkaroff," growled a voice from the doorway. "You won't withdraw from the competition at all. You keep complaining as if you're the biggest victim, but the real victim hasn't spoken up for himself yet." Moody limped toward Karkaroff, his right foot making a loud thud with each step. "Sorry, I'm afraid I don't understand you," Karkaroff stammered, instinctively stepping back. Realizing everyone was watching, he stepped forward again, his anger rising. "Aren't Durmstrang and Boban's victims? And what do you mean by real victims?" "I know what you're thinking," Moody shouted. "You're still wondering who at Hogwarts put Hermione Granger's name into the Goblet of Fire, giving Hogwarts 2 chances. Isn't it?" Madame Maxime interjected, raising her chin defiantly. Perhaps, due to her response, Professor Moody showed a measure of restraint. The disdain in his voice was unmistakable to everyone present. "Everyone knows that Miss Hermione Granger is merely an underage witch. If the person responsible for this truly intended to give Hogwarts a second chance, why not choose someone who appears capable of winning?" Moody's mismatched blue eyes, one large and one small, were fixed on Karkaroff, and he offered a menacing smile. "From my perspective, there are only 2 possibilities. Either the person behind this harbors a deep hatred for Miss Granger and wants her to perish in the tasks, or," Moody's tone grew more ominous, "Miss Granger is simply an innocent caught in the crossfire. The perpetrator has a vendetta against Hogwarts and seeks to plunge it into chaos. If she were to lose her life, Hogwarts would be in serious trouble. What a farce, right? We have 2 champions, and one of them dies." Hermione's scalp tingled with fear, and she felt Professor McGonagall, who was gripping her shoulders, tighten her hold on her arm. "Dumbledore, Atticus, are we?" The firelight illuminated Professor McGonagall's face, capturing her heart-wrenching expression with vivid detail. Is there another way to safely remove Granger from the position of champion? Karkaroff clearly grasped the implication of Moody's words and was about to protest loudly, but Professor McGonagall's question silenced him momentarily. If there truly was a way to make it clear that this was a mistake, it would be best to have the troublesome young girl exit the competition. There will be a way. Dumbledore's words shocked everyone. Was there really a way to prevent Granger from becoming a champion without nullifying the process? What was the point of their argument now? Was Dumbledore merely toying with them? Even Atticus Blaine's brow furrowed slightly. If we unanimously agree to destroy the Goblet of Fire, the magical contract's backlash will cease to exist. Miss Granger can safely withdraw from the competition, and we can continue with the remaining 3 champions, Dumbledore stated calmly, looking directly at Atticus. Atticus's eyelids twitched as he grasped Dumbledore's meaning. Destroy the Goblet of Fire? Even Karkaroff, who had been the most vocal, fell silent. To him, Dumbledore's suggestion was nothing short of absurd. The Goblet of Fire was a priceless magical artifact and historical relic. Neither the Ministry of Magic nor the International Confederation of Wizards would consent to its destruction. However, if Dumbledore insisted, Moody's magical eye nearly bulged from its socket at the abruptness of the plan. He had never anticipated that his speculation would lead to such a conclusion. I will never allow. Barty Crouch straightened his usually stooped posture for the first time that night. Instead of addressing Dumbledore, he stepped out of the firelight and fixed Karkaroff with a piercing gaze. The Goblet of Fire is a valuable artifact that has been preserved for centuries. I will not permit its destruction after its first use in centuries. The Ministry of Magic will certainly oppose this plan. Karkaroff, intimidated by Crouch's glare, licked his lips nervously, as if to assert that he was not the one who proposed the plan. If you think it's unfair, Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, then we all agree that the final score for Hogwarts should be an average of Cedric Diggory and Hermione Granger's scores. That's the solution. Everyone must compete. According to your logic, it's Dumbledore who should be complaining now, right? As soon as Crouch finished speaking, Moody grinned wickedly at Karkaroff. No one expects an underage witch to excel in the competition. Hogwarts is already burdened with too many setbacks. Despite her feigned worry, Hermione couldn't help but feel a flicker of anger at Professor Moody's words. Dumbledore's and Atticus Blaine's eyes met briefly before parting. Hogwarts has no objections, Atticus stated calmly. Then how should we explain it to the public? Ludo Bagman inquired cheerfully. The new regulations of the Triwizard Tournament, Atticus replied, casting a glance at Bagman, allow the host school to have 2 champions. Atticus then turned his attention to Professor Karkaroff, whose face had flushed red once more. This rule can remain in place, Professor Karkaroff. I trust it will keep you enthusiastic when organizing the evaluations for the next competition. End of this chapter. Chapter 5572, Snape's Clues. The first task is to test your courage, so we won't reveal what it entails. The courage to face the unknown is a crucial quality for wizards. You must complete it entirely on your own, without seeking or accepting any help from your teachers. The only weapon you will have is your wand. The details of the second task will not be disclosed until the first task is completed. After Barty Crouch provided the necessary reminders, as per the regulations, the stormy atmosphere of the evening seemed to subside. Many felt there was no reason to linger any longer. Barty quickly departed Hogwarts through the fireplace in the room, while Ludo Bagman opted to stay. Consequently, Dumbledore arranged for Snape to escort him to a resting place. Karkaroff and Maxime had already left with Victor and Fleur, who clearly had something to discuss. Before leaving, one glanced at Hermione and the other at Atticus Blaine, but both were hurriedly taken away by their respective headmasters. In contrast, the 2 Hogwarts champions remained. If there's nothing else, I'll escort Miss Granger back to her dormitory. So much has happened tonight, and she needs to rest, Professor McGonagall informed Dumbledore and Atticus, her concern evident despite the general relief. Wait, Atticus interjected suddenly. He paused, then addressed Professor McGonagall. If it's convenient, could you please accompany Miss Granger back to the lounge and share some of the conclusions from tonight's discussion with the students who are eagerly awaiting news? Professor McGonagall's expression softened, and Hermione gave a grateful smile, understanding the intent behind Atticus's request. Now, only Dumbledore, Atticus, and Professor Moody remained in the room, uncertain if Cedric had left with them. To be honest, Cedric was likely the most overlooked person tonight. The focus was either on the grievances of the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang champions, or the revelation of Hermione Granger's name being ejected from the Goblet of Fire, which had completely altered the situation. "Cedric, I suggest you go back and rest," Dumbledore said, smiling at the bewildered Cedric. "I believe Pomona and the Hufflepuff students are eager to celebrate with you. They finally have a reason to celebrate, and it would be unfair to deny them this opportunity." Atticus also offered Cedric an encouraging smile, which helped Cedric regain his sense of purpose as a champion. He nodded respectfully and exited the room. "That despicable Karkaroff," Moody exclaimed once Cedric had left. "I bet he's involved somehow. He's always resented Atticus for outmaneuvering him in the competition to host the tournament and has been plotting revenge to cause trouble for Hogwarts. I've seen through him. You must remember how he evaded punishment and framed others for his misdeeds." "Alastor," Dumbledore interjected calmly, his expression unchanged. "If you'd let me search that ship, Albus, just wait. I'm sure there will be a discovery," Professor Moody shouted, his anger unabated. "I understand your determination to clear Hogwarts' name, Professor Moody," Atticus said, moving to a sofa and sitting down with a sigh of relief. He looked at Moody meaningfully and continued, "But Karkaroff is the headmaster of Durmstrang, not a young wizard like Draco Malfoy. Without concrete evidence, it's inappropriate to use unconventional methods against him." Moody sneered, seemingly dismissive of Atticus's reasoning. "I'll keep an eye on him for you," Dumbledore assured. Atticus Blaine needed to summarize the events of the evening. Since Albus hadn't invited him, it was clear he didn't want Atticus lingering around, and it was even less likely that Brian would be forthcoming with him. After expressing his anger, Professor Moody struck his cane against the floor and exited the room. Atticus continued to gaze at the door Moody had closed behind him, remaining silent. Dumbledore mirrored his silence, staring into the fireplace where Barty Crouch had departed, the flames casting a golden hue over his blue eyes. The two men stood like statues, enveloped in silence, until footsteps echoed outside the door. It was Severus Snape. He opened the door, peering inside, and upon seeing Dumbledore and Atticus still present, he stepped in. "I've sent Bagman to his quarters," Snape announced from the doorway. "Ah, thank you," Dumbledore replied with a nod and a smile. "We owe Ludo gratitude for his support tonight. I don't know if you noticed, Atticus, but he was the only one who didn't fault us for our mistakes. This man is a compulsive gambler, lacking any sense of restraint," Atticus remarked casually, understanding Dumbledore's implication. "Naturally, he's pleased to see chaos unfold, as it provides him an opportunity to exploit the situation and profit from the illegal betting markets." Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully, lapsing into silence once more. Snape, with a hint of sarcasm in his eyes, looked at Dumbledore. After a brief pause, he spoke lazily. "I have a question, Dumbledore. Can your age line prevent wizards who have consumed Polyjuice Potion?" Atticus's wandering gaze suddenly sharpened, focusing intently on Snape's nonchalant expression. He noticed Dumbledore's concern mirrored his own. "Polyjuice Potion? Why do you mention this, Severus? Do you have any leads on tonight's events?" "You seem to place a lot of trust in that Granger from Minerva College," Snape replied softly. "But I discovered someone had sneaked into my office last night, taking items from my personal storage. Bicorn horn powder, fragments of African tree snake skin. The thief wasn't greedy, taking only a little, but since my last inventory, I've been more vigilant." "You suspect Miss Granger used Polyjuice Potion again, Severus?" Dumbledore asked quietly. Atticus's confusion dissipated. Like Dumbledore, he believed Snape had uncovered a clue. Indeed, on his first night back at Hogwarts since graduation, he had seen Hermione in the school hospital, suffering from a Polyjuice Potion mishap. "If you're convinced of Granger's innocence, Dumbledore," Snape said, "I can overlook it, as I did last time." Atticus chuckled at the sarcasm in Snape's voice. "Then overlook it, Professor Snape. I suggest you store those materials in a more secure location to prevent anyone from blowing up your office to get them." Dumbledore's lips twitched, but he remained silent, their attitudes revealing much. Snape's eyes narrowed, not looking at Dumbledore, knowing he would get no answers from him. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Atticus and asked softly, "You know who did it? You knew this would happen, didn't you? Atticus, tell me, who is targeting that self-righteous, foolish girl?" "Are you testing my occlumency skills, Professor?" Atticus smiled calmly. "Forgive my immodesty, but in this area, I've learned as much as you, perhaps even surpassed you." It was truly exhausting. Dealing with two scheming individuals, particularly the ever-smiling Atticus Blaine, truly irritated him. Consequently, Snape stormed off in anger. "Tell me what you think, Headmaster Dumbledore," Atticus said, his amusement evident as he watched Professor Snape's frustration. Finally, his smile faded. Having barely slept the previous night and refusing to allow himself any laziness today, Atticus felt a wave of fatigue wash over him. He decided to get straight to the point. End of this chapter. Chapter 573, Attitude Crackling. Dumbledore pointed his wand at the fireplace, causing the flames to blaze fiercely. He then courteously invited all the portraits on the wall to leave. At Hogwarts, portraits were bound to obey the headmaster, a rule enforced by a binding contract. Yet Dumbledore dismissed them regardless. "My opinion is that it wasn't Tom's idea," Dumbledore said calmly, as if the surprise from the recent incident had completely dissipated. "What do you mean?" Atticus Blaine rubbed his temples. "Is this like the self-initiated action at the Quidditch Cup? Not inspired by Voldemort, but a clever little scheme concocted by Professor Moody himself?" "I can't give you a definite answer, Atticus," Dumbledore replied, finding a sofa for himself. He leaned back into the soft cushions, his gaze fixed on the ornate chandelier hanging from the ceiling. His slender fingers were interlaced on his knees. "What I can tell you is that unless Tom changed his mind during those more than 10 years of suffering, he would not choose Miss Granger. He lacks your keen and intelligent insight to recognize Miss Granger's extraordinary qualities. We all assumed he would target Harry, which aligns with Tom's past behavior, unless—" Dumbledore looked at Atticus, his blue eyes gleaming. "Something happened that made Tom reconsider his plan to prevent me from seeing through his intention to use Harry's resurrection. So, he might be willing to heed someone else's advice." Atticus nodded slightly. Voldemort now had few advisors, none more prominent than that foolish woman masquerading as Alastor Moody. "A reasonable guess, Headmaster Dumbledore," Atticus said. "At the Quidditch World Cup, Vitia Cleona attempted to take Harry to Voldemort before he returned to school, causing a commotion. This failed operation likely made Voldemort suspect you would be more vigilant, prompting him to conceal his true intentions more carefully. So the only question now is, why does Cleona focus on Hermione Granger?" "I don't think Miss Granger's outstanding achievements were appreciated by your friend," Dumbledore said with a smile. "If Tom were making the decision, Mr. Ron Weasley would be a more likely choice." "That is to say," Atticus mused, ignoring Dumbledore's teasing, "Cleona saw something that led her to believe the relationship between Harry and Hermione should be closer. Through Hermione, she could ensure that involving Harry in the game would provide an opportunity to take him from under our noses. The argument she presented must have convinced Voldemort." Atticus frowned slightly, lost in thought. Before the school year began, the only encounter between Vitia Cleona and Hermione was likely at the World Cup. Or perhaps Cleona had repeated her old tactics and conducted a thorough investigation at Hermione's home? "We'll never know the full truth through speculation, Atticus," Dumbledore cautioned, noticing Atticus's mind wandering. His expression turned worried. "I'm more concerned about Miss Granger now. Atticus, do you think we should continue to adhere to our original views?" Atticus raised his eyebrows and then fell silent. To be honest, Dumbledore's question and the attitude behind it surprised him. He had never seen Dumbledore so hesitant, but upon reflection, he could fully understand Dumbledore's concerns. There is a significant difference between Harry and Hermione when facing Voldemort. Hermione lacks the protective blood magic Lily Evans bestowed with her life. She does not harbor a fragment of Voldemort's soul within her. Nor does she possess the ancient magic Dumbledore had prepared as a precaution. She was talented and possessed a resilient character, yet she wasn't as special as Harry. Dumbledore and Atticus Blaine could rest assured that Harry would face Voldemort, knowing that Voldemort could not kill Harry, but Hermione was a different matter. Without any defenses, Hermione would not survive against Voldemort. Dumbledore and Atticus tacitly allowed Voldemort's resurrection to ensure his ultimate demise. However, neither could accept Hermione becoming the first casualty in the impending war following Voldemort's return. Even if sacrifices were inevitable, the thought of losing a promising young witch was unbearable. The current predicament was that, due to their silent agreement, Hermione had entered into a contract with the Goblet of Fire. This was a genuine concern. Suddenly, Atticus's eyelids fluttered. As he contemplated the challenges Hermione might face, a long-buried memory surfaced, confirming one crucial fact. "I do not believe Miss Granger's life will be endangered by the forthcoming events," Atticus stated firmly. "I think the risk is manageable." A peculiar glint appeared in Dumbledore's eyes as he regarded Atticus with mild surprise. He sensed that the hesitation that had previously clouded Atticus had vanished, replaced by a newfound calm. "What leads you to such a confident conclusion, Atticus? You must realize we are discussing a student's life," Dumbledore inquired. "I'm certain, Headmaster Dumbledore," Atticus replied with composure, meeting Dumbledore's gaze. The subtle intensity in his eyes prompted a flurry of thoughts in Dumbledore's mind. "I will ensure that Hermione Granger and all the champions remain safe." Atticus rose, signaling the end of their discussion. "Are you still unwilling to share how you met that remarkable lady, Atticus?" Dumbledore asked as Atticus turned to leave. Atticus paused, not looking back. His mind drifted to the previous July, not to his first encounter with Vitia Cleona at the orphanage, but to their journey to Stonehenge. As they entered Stonehenge, the Mirror of Erised revealed a little girl crying and making solemn vows on a stormy night amidst the ruins of happier times. "Not a tale for today, Headmaster Dumbledore." Atticus shook his head. But before Dumbledore could express disappointment, he added, "When the time is right, I'll share some of it with you." The Office of Student Safety was bathed in a reddish glow from the smoldering pine wood in the fireplace. Outside, the cold wind howled, and in the forbidden forest, the trees swayed wildly, resembling raging waves. Atticus lay on his bed, arms behind his head, as thoughts raced through his mind. Hermione Granger becoming a champion, Barty Crouch being controlled, and Moody's name constantly echoing around him. The progress of Vitia Cleona and Remus, Sirius's situation within the Ministry of Magic, and Voldemort's gradual rise. Once open war commenced, the battle between him and Dumbledore would unfold. What puzzled him was why the scepter belonging to Herbo, which he had missed on Avalon Island, had driven Vitia Cleona to align with Voldemort. Atticus frowned slightly, feeling an urge to rush to Moody's office, confront Cleona, and uncover the answers to his questions. The impulse was so strong that, when Atticus regained his senses, he found himself gripping his wand, but reason ultimately prevailed, and he relinquished the notion. The woman was so cautious that she had established disguises and defenses at the very level of her soul. The notion of forcibly controlling her for interrogation and then erasing her memory seemed nearly impossible. Even as he lay on the bed, Atticus Blaine felt a heavy weight pressing down on his shoulders. Loneliness was inevitable, and the air was cold at such great heights. During his time at Hogwarts, Professor Snape's overt and covert protection had been one of his pillars of support. But now, he was the one who had to provide shelter to others, and no one was qualified to protect him, not even Dumbledore or Lido. "Go to sleep," he murmured softly, releasing a faint sigh. Atticus turned over, facing the endless darkness outside the window, and gradually drifted into a deep sleep. End of this chapter. Chapter 574, Professor McGonagall's Concern. With the selection of the champions finalized, the much-anticipated Triwizard Tournament was finally underway. Under normal circumstances, the castle would be brimming with excitement and joy, but recent events had cast a shadow of unpredictability over everything. Accompanied by Professor McGonagall, Hermione ascended the stairs, feeling the weight of the portrait's gazes upon her. The figures in the paintings pointed and whispered as she passed, not out of malice, but because they saw the situation as noteworthy, a perfect excuse for a gathering. As Hermione neared Gryffindor Tower, her steps grew heavier. She realized that facing the scrutiny of the wizarding world's elite in the back room of the auditorium was daunting, but what lay ahead was even more terrifying. Sensing Hermione's apprehension, Professor McGonagall gently squeezed her shoulder. They finally reached the entrance to the Gryffindor common room, and Professor McGonagall paused, holding Hermione back from the fat lady's portrait. Hermione looked up to find Professor McGonagall smiling at her, though the smile was tinged with concern. "I must admit, Miss Granger, this situation strikes me as quite peculiar," Professor McGonagall said, her shoulders trembling slightly. After taking a deep breath, she continued in an unusually gentle tone, "Regardless of the intentions of whoever put your name into the Goblet of Fire, you are now a champion. I hope you can embody Gryffindor spirit and face the challenges ahead with courage. Can you achieve a good result?" Hermione's eyes welled with tears, unsure how to respond to Professor McGonagall's expectations. "There have always been whispers among the students, claiming you only know how to study. It's a ridiculous notion, one the professors have always dismissed. But, Miss Granger, this is your chance to dispel those rumors once and for all." "But," Hermione began, her mind swirling with doubts. She tried to focus on Professor McGonagall's words. "Beauxbatons and Durmstrang have chosen their best students, as has Cedric Diggory. Professor Blaine also mentioned the dangers of the Tri-Wizard tournament, and I don't feel I have enough magical skill. Professor McGonagall, I don't know if I—" "Oh, Miss Granger," Professor McGonagall interrupted, "I can't speak for the teaching quality at Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, but as for Cedric Diggory, yes, he's talented. However, I believe you surpass him, Miss Granger. If he can handle the challenges, there's no reason you can't." Under the warm glow of the firelight, Hermione stared at Professor McGonagall, wide-eyed. She could hardly believe the high praise from someone who is typically reserved with compliments. "Ah, of course," Professor McGonagall added with a rare, playful wink. "I wouldn't want my opinion of you to reach Pomona's ears. Do you understand me, Miss Granger?" This playful side of Professor McGonagall was astonishing, given her usual dignified demeanor in front of students. "I already told you," came Harry's impatient voice as the fat lady's portrait swung open. "Hermione has been with me, Ron, Hagrid, and a large group of Durmstrang and Beauxbatons students all day. They can all vouch for her." The Gryffindor common room was packed, with students from 1st to 7th year gathered in a buzzing throng. At the heart of the crowd stood a few of Hermione's close friends. "Potter!" Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the din as she entered the room, her expression as stern as ever. She stood at the entrance, calling for Harry, but the noise of the crowd drowned her out. All eyes were on Harry, oblivious to Professor McGonagall and Hermione's arrival. "Mr. Potter!" She called again, her voice firm and commanding. "Could you please get down from the table?" Harry, weary from repeatedly answering the same questions, was surrounded by curious classmates. They all wanted to know how Hermione's name ended up in the Goblet of Fire. Despite his insistence that Hermione hadn't had the time, nor would she have done it secretly, his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Ron, who should have been backing him up, remained silent. Finally, Harry heard Professor McGonagall's voice. He turned towards the entrance and saw her standing there, looking stern. Beside her, Hermione gave him a reassuring smile. "Oh, sorry, Professor McGonagall," Harry exclaimed, jumping down from the table in a fluster. In his haste, he accidentally stepped on Ginny's foot, eliciting a yelp of pain. He barely had time to apologize before he pushed through the crowd to reach Professor McGonagall. "How's it going?" Harry asked Hermione, his green eyes wide with concern. Hermione, understanding the strain in his voice, gave him a reassuring blink. Their long-standing friendship allowed Harry to sense that things weren't as dire as they seemed. Hermione's smile suggested she hadn't been expelled, which was a relief. Feeling slightly more at ease, Harry turned his attention to Professor McGonagall. Her expression wasn't as severe as he had feared. Behind him, the Gryffindor students stood quietly, aware of their head of house's strict adherence to rules. It was unusual for so many to be gathered in the common room at this hour, and it was clear Professor McGonagall wasn't pleased. However, she didn't express anger. "The school believes," she began, addressing the anxious students, "that you should know the truth about what happened tonight and Hermione Granger being chosen as a champion. The students listened intently, their eyes fixed on Professor McGonagall and the silent Hermione. Currently, the Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts, Bosbattens, and Durmstrang have agreed that Miss Granger's name appearing in the Goblet of Fire was not her doing. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Despite Harry's repeated assurances, no one had believed him. After all, who would be so generous as to enter someone else's name into the Goblet of Fire to make them a champion? "Who did it, Professor?" Fred Weasley asked, raising his hand. "Have you found out?" "Unfortunately, Mr. Weasley, not yet," Professor McGonagall replied, her voice taking on a slightly colder tone. "But I believe the truth will come to light eventually." "Then how did you determine it wasn't Hermione who entered her name, and why would someone do that?" Angelina inquired, her curiosity piqued. Atticus Blaine couldn't help but ask. These two issues were indeed significant, but unfortunately, Professor McGonagall did not provide an explanation. Her silence indicated that the conclusion was a consensus reached through discussion, and no one should question it. Having said what she intended, Professor McGonagall gently nudged Hermione towards the crowd and turned to leave. Just as she placed one foot in the doorway, she seemed to remember something. Turning back to the Gryffindor students, her expression softened, and she even managed a slight smile. "Oh yes," she said with a casual shrug. "After further discussion, Hermione Granger's status as a champion has been confirmed." With those words, Professor McGonagall promptly exited the lounge, leaving behind a wave of cheers that reverberated through the floor as the portrait of the fat lady swung shut. End of this chapter. Chapter 5 Celebration and Helplessness. The sudden uproar that filled her ears nearly caused Hermione to stumble. In a whirlwind of motion, she was pulled into the depths of the common room by a dozen eager hands. The students, who had been silent in front of Professor McGonagall, erupted into cheers, whistles, and shouts. Harry stood in stunned silence as Hermione vanished from his sight. He had only witnessed such a scene once before, when he won the Quidditch Cup the previous year. "Wait!" Harry shouted, snapping back to reality and trying desperately to retrieve Hermione. Professor McGonagall had just clarified something that seemed glaringly obvious to him. For the finer details, he knew he would have to ask Hermione about the argument that had unfolded in the back room of the auditorium. Hermione was overwhelmed by the enthusiastic faces surrounding her. While she was known for her excellent grades, which earned her some recognition among her peers, most young wizards were more interested in thrilling topics and admired those like Harry, who excelled in popular sports. She had never received such a warm reception, and the high-pitched cheers made it difficult for her to think clearly. "We were just complaining that you wouldn't let us put our names in the Goblet of Fire, but you secretly came up with the idea yourself," George shouted, his face alight with excitement. "Oh, who would be so kind?" Fred chimed in. "Why couldn't he put our names in?" "Sorry," Angelina exclaimed, pushing through the crowd to reach Hermione. She spoke loudly and apologetically. "I thought the same as Fred and George. I thought you were teasing me, Hermione. Oh, congratulations! At least you can represent Gryffindor, right?" Hermione felt a sudden urge to cry. When Professor Blaine had called her name, the distrustful, sarcastic, and angry eyes had felt like a prison. Now, her Gryffindor classmates were pulling her out of that hell. Yet, she knew the challenges ahead were still daunting, and there were many things she needed to understand. Unfortunately, there was no opportunity to discuss them with Harry and Ron. Speaking of Ron, she had seen Harry, but Ron was nowhere to be found. An uneasy feeling crept into her heart. She stood on tiptoe, scanning the room, but the tall classmates blocked her view, and even Harry was lost in the crowd. Fred and George conjured up an array of food and drinks, and the celebration began in earnest. The Gryffindors were thrilled that someone could finally represent their house in the prestigious competition. They paid no attention to the expressions of those involved. Hermione felt like a quaffle on the Quidditch field, being tossed around. Faces blurred before her, and snacks and butterbeer were thrust into her hands. She was compelled to eat and drink until she was satisfied, with no chance to refuse. The agility she had honed in Professor Blaine's class was useless in the crowded room, and her strength was insufficient to resist the enthusiasm of her peers. By the end, her bushy, curly hair was a tangled mess, resembling the lion's mane on the Gryffindor flag that had somehow ended up draped over her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed, mainly from the butterbeer. Hermione ended up vomiting all over Neville, not due to the weak alcohol content, but simply from being overfed. Seeing her distress, the crowd finally began to calm down, though they still refused to let her go. Was amiss quickly tried to reassure Hermione. "Don't worry, Hermione," he said gently. "We'll figure this out together. You're not alone in this." Hermione nodded, though her eyes still held a shadow of fear. "Thank you, Harry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that continued to gust through the open window. Atticus Blaine, the professor who had defended her, was a man of great wisdom and integrity. His intervention had been crucial in clearing Hermione's name, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude towards him. Yet, the mystery of who had put her name in the Goblet of Fire lingered, casting a low shadow over her thoughts. Ron, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke up. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice serious. "If someone is trying to set Hermione up, they might try something else." Ginny nodded in agreement. "We should keep an eye out for anything unusual," she added, her eyes scanning the corridor as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. The group stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. The cold wind continued to swirl around them, a stark contrast to the warmth of the common room they had just left. It was a reminder of the challenges they faced, both known and unknown. Finally, Harry broke the silence. "Let's head back," he suggested. "We can talk more in the common room where it's warmer." The others nodded, and together they made their way back down the spiral staircase. As they walked, Hermione felt a renewed sense of determination. With her friends by her side and the support of Professor Blaine, she knew she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Sensing something was amiss, Harry immediately asked, "What's wrong, Hermione?" "What else did Professor Blaine say?" "It's Professor Moody," Hermione replied, her lips pale and trembling. She struggled to keep her voice steady, hoping Harry and the others wouldn't notice her fear. "Professor Moody believes that whoever is behind all this despises me and wants something terrible to happen to me, especially concerning the competition events." Harry's face turned ashen, and Ron nearly exclaimed, "That's Malfoy!" However, both managed to hold back their words. "Is there anything else?" Ginny inquired, noticing that Hermione seemed to have more to share. "Yes, there is," Hermione continued, her brown eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Someone wants to make a mockery of Hogwarts by allowing 2 champions to represent the school. Then, if one of them were to meet with an accident during the tournament, it would completely tarnish Hogwarts' reputation." End of this chapter. Chapter 576, Ron's Attitude. Hermione recounted everything that transpired in the small room after she entered the auditorium. What worried Harry the most was undoubtedly the theory proposed by Professor Moody. Either someone harbored a deep hatred for Hermione and wanted her to meet a tragic end during a perilous task, or someone wished ill upon Hogwarts. By giving the school 2 champions, they aimed to make Hogwarts a target of hostility and exclusion, ultimately leading to Hermione's demise. Considering the dangers of the competition, additional schemes might not even be necessary. "You can't participate in the tournament." Harry's green eyes blazed with fury in the torchlight. "They know the risks, yet they dare to involve you. How could they?" Hermione stood silently, arms crossed, leaning against the cold wall. "I'm going to find Professor McGonagall, or Professor Blaine, or Dumbledore. Someone has to intervene. They can't just stand by and let you die," Harry declared, his voice filled with determination. Perhaps it was Hermione's account or Harry's impassioned words, but Ron seemed taken aback. He hadn't fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Ginny, looking at Hermione with sympathy, countered Harry's outburst. "You can't change the outcome, Harry. The professors have already devised a plan, and it won't work." "Then what?" Harry exclaimed, his voice rising, though he was at a loss for words. What could they do? As Professor Dumbledore had mentioned, disrupting the Goblet of Fire, the Triwizard Tournament, and the dreams of the other 3 innocent champions was not an option. Harry would gladly do it, but he knew he couldn't persuade anyone, not a professor, nor even his classmates eager for excitement. Maybe it won't be so dangerous, Ginny suggested, trying to soothe Harry's agitation. After this incident, Professor Blaine will undoubtedly scrutinize the competition tasks. He won't allow any more tampering. It will be a fair contest, right? Hermione is just as capable as Diggory in physical education. If Diggory can handle the challenges, so can Hermione. But Professor Blaine mentioned before, Harry interjected, frowning. Ginny's words made sense, yet he couldn't shake his unease. The Triwizard Tournament tests overall ability, not just dueling skills. Those 3 champions are exceptional among senior wizards. They've mastered knowledge we haven't yet learned. It was surprising that Harry could articulate such a perspective, a point of view that even Hermione hadn't anticipated. She looked at the anxious Harry, her heart touched by his concern. Hermione has gone through all the tutorials, right? Ginny asked, raising her chin. During the summer, I saw you reading the 6th grade textbook Percy left behind. Oh, Hermione replied weakly. I just memorized them. Analyzing the situation, Hermione's disadvantage didn't seem insurmountable, even though she was still 2 years away from being a legal champion. What do they want the champions to do in the first task? No one knew better than Harry and Ron how talented Hermione was among the younger wizards. If any of the 3 of them deserved to be a champion, Harry believed it was Hermione. Yet, the current circumstances made it hard to celebrate. Although she had mentioned it before, Hermione reiterated Barty Crouch's final instructions to the champions. That's it? They didn't say anything more? Harry shouted, frustrated. They should give you some special consideration. You're the youngest champion, Hermione. Anyway, the competition must be more challenging for you. It's not your fault you're being targeted, Harry exclaimed, his mind racing with possibilities. Who could have dragged Hermione into this mess? Could it be Snape? He pondered, an idea suddenly striking him. Professor Blaine had mentioned that only those in the small room could influence the Goblet of Fire's decision. Harry considered the suspects: Professor McGonagall, Professor Moody, Professor Blaine, Dumbledore, and Snape. The more Harry thought about it, the more suspicious Snape seemed. He's the most likely culprit, Harry fumed. Professor Blaine has a good relationship with him and wouldn't suspect him. Dumbledore trusts him too, but Snape has never liked me being in the spotlight in his class, and he doesn't like Dumbledore either. He'd be thrilled if Dumbledore lost face. Despite Harry's conviction, no one else seemed to agree with him, not even Hermione. Frustrated, Harry declared, I'm going to write to Sirius and tell him about this. He's an Auror now. Maybe he can help us investigate Snape. Given the current information, there wasn't much more to discuss. Hermione would have to face the risky competitions regardless. What do you think, Ron? Harry asked, hoping for support. But Ron remained silent, unusually so. Typically, he would join Harry in criticizing Snape. Congratulations, Ron muttered awkwardly, breaking the silence. His unease was palpable, and Harry, sensing it, turned the conversation to him. But Ron's response was unexpected. What? Harry asked, confused, as Ginny also looked at Ron with puzzlement. Hermione, meanwhile, trembled slightly, her eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the fire. Ron, facing Harry but seemingly speaking to no one in particular, forced a twisted smile. You've all heard what Professor Blaine said. The Triwizard Tournament will be broadcast live across magical communities in Europe, using the same method he used to monitor the school. This means that once the game starts, thousands of wizards will see your face. You might become more famous than Lockhart. Plus, there's a large sum of gold at the end. Professor Blaine won't cheat people with fake goblin gold like Ludo Bagman did. Hermione's face remained hidden in the firelight's shadows, her sadness obscured. What are you talking about? Harry snapped. We're discussing the danger Hermione faces and whether Snape is involved. Ron shrugged again, seemingly enjoying the gesture. There shouldn't be any problem, right? I mean, no one will be sacrificed in the competition. Professor Blaine and Dumbledore are overseeing it. If they've decided to hold the competition again, they must be confident. Maybe they're just exaggerating the tension, like in second year, when Professor Blaine bluffed about the Inferi. I'm going back to rest, Hermione suddenly announced, pushing away from the wall. She took a deep breath and hurried off, not giving anyone a chance to respond. When Harry and the others caught up, they only saw her retreating into the common room. Even after returning to the dormitory, the celebration of Hermione becoming a champion continued. Neville sat on the edge of his bed, a bottle of butterbeer in hand, grinning foolishly. Harry watched the scene unfold, his mind still troubled by the day's events. Atticus Blaine sat quietly, not joining in the lively conversation around him. He was engrossed in writing a letter to Sirius, his pen moving furiously across the paper. The act of writing reminded him of how much he missed Sirius. Since their argument over the summer, they hadn't seen each other, though their exchanged letters had carefully avoided mentioning the conflict. To convey the full story, Atticus's letter ended up being longer than any essay he had written since starting at Hogwarts. After folding the letter, he decided he would head to the owlery early the next morning to find Hedwig. He sat back in his chair, gazing out the window into the inky darkness, listening to the distant roar of the waves in the forbidden forest. Despite the tranquility of the scene, his thoughts were troubled, particularly with concern for Hermione. It was a peculiar feeling. Over the years, Atticus had found himself in more predicaments than any other student at Hogwarts. Usually, Hermione was there to offer sound advice, but this time, it was Hermione who seemed troubled. Could he provide her with the support she needed? He wished fervently that his mind could be as sharp and insightful as hers. With a sigh, Atticus tucked the letter into his robe pocket, and Dad stood up. Seamus and Dean were still celebrating, but Neville had already collapsed onto his bed, a half-empty bottle of butterbeer spilling onto the quilt, oblivious to the mess. The sight was amusing, and Atticus instinctively wanted to share it with Ron. However, Ron was already asleep, facing the wall and motionless, his head buried under the covers. "All right," Atticus muttered, mimicking Ron's earlier shrug, and prepared to wash up. But after taking just a couple of steps, he paused and glanced back at Ron's bed. An inexplicable wave of sadness washed over him, rising from deep within his heart. Chapter 577, Clumsy Protection. On Sunday morning, Hermione awoke to a clear sky, yet she felt an overwhelming sense of fatigue and sadness. The events of the previous night had left her restless, tossing and turning in bed, haunted by dreams she wished to avoid. The dormitory was silent. Lavender and Parvati had already left their beds. With great effort, Hermione sat up, drew back the curtain of her four-poster bed, and gazed at the book wall opposite her. Unlike the boys' dormitories, which were often dull and unchanging, the girls' dormitory was vibrant and personalized. Each of the three girls had distinct bedding. Hermione used the standard school-provided sheets, while Lavender and Parvati's beds were adorned with bright colors and charming decorations. Hermione's collection of books near her bed was her way of adding character to her space. If she could, Hermione would have preferred to remain in this quiet sanctuary, avoiding the impending challenges of the Triwizard Tournament. But she knew that was not an option. Slipping on her slippers, she made her way to the bathroom. The girl reflected in the mirror had dark circles under her eyes, her hair was a tangled mess, and her pajama collar was askew, revealing one shoulder. She looked disheveled. From years of dealing with unruly hair, Hermione knew that a quick shower was the fastest way to get ready. She leaned against the wall to steady herself, still groggy from lack of sleep, and began to unbutton her pajamas. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if trying to prolong her time in the room. As she unbuttoned the third button, her pajamas slipped off her shoulders. The chilly November air made her shiver, and she noticed goosebumps forming on her bare arms. Realizing she couldn't afford to waste time, she quickly shed the rest of her clothes and prepared for her shower. Just as she stepped out of the mirror's view, Hermione paused and returned. She examined her reflection, straightening her posture and scrutinizing her body's outline. Even with a critical eye, she knew she would score high marks. Startled by this unexpected thought, she blushed and hurried away from the mirror, jumping into the shower. Parvati and Lavender have been comparing themselves since second year. There's no shame in that, she thought, embarrassed, as the hot water enveloped her. Being Sunday, students were allowed to wear their own clothes instead of wizard robes. 10 minutes later, Hermione stood before the mirror again, dressed in jeans and a loose light blue sweatshirt. Satisfied that, aside from the dark circles, she looked her usual self, she exhaled a sigh of relief. Her school bag felt lighter, having been emptied, but she paid it no mind. She lingered behind the dormitory door for several minutes, took a deep breath, and finally stepped out. Hermione descended the spiral staircase to the common room below. As soon as she reached the bottom, as Atticus Blaine appeared, his classmates, who had already finished breakfast, warmly welcomed him once more. Colin, a year younger than Atticus, rushed over with a camera to capture the moment. This was the first time Atticus had seen Colin so eager, as Colin usually only showed interest in Harry. It was then that Atticus understood why Harry was present. Whenever Colin asked for a photo, he always seemed a bit embarrassed. "Sorry, Colin. I got up a little late. I have to head to the auditorium for breakfast and then to the library," Hermione said hurriedly as she squeezed between the Creevey brothers. She quickly made her way to the portrait hole, pushed it open, climbed out, and encountered Harry on his way back. "You're up," Harry said, a bit surprised, as he showed Hermione a stack of bread wrapped in a napkin. "I went to the owlery to send a letter to Sirius this morning, and then I waited for you in the Great Hall. When I didn't see you coming down, I brought you some." "Oh, thanks," Hermione replied gratefully. "Are you going to the library?" Harry asked again. After Hermione confirmed, Harry muttered, "Wait," and Dee rushed back into the lounge. A few minutes later, he reappeared, slightly out of breath, carrying his school bag. "I also need to go." The last time they had gone to the library together was the previous school year, when they were helping Hagrid find legal materials beneficial to Buckbeak. So, it wasn't surprising that Harry understood Hermione's surprise. "I'm looking for information related to the paper assigned by Professor Sinise," Harry admitted, scratching his face in embarrassment and looking away. "You should focus on the competition projects. There's no need for you to worry about Ron and my after-school homework." Hermione pursed her lips and smiled. "No one is going to attack me in the castle during the day, Harry. Of course, I know I'm going to hear a lot of nasty comments." "Oh, you can see that," Harry exclaimed, realizing that Hermione, being very perceptive, had already understood his intentions. It would have been strange if she hadn't. "Where's Ron?" Hermione asked as they left the corridor in front of the fat lady's portrait and began descending the spiral staircase from the tower. "Still eating in the auditorium," Harry replied with a hint of complaint. "I asked him to come with me because the person who put your name in the goblet of fire had ill intentions towards you, and they might try something again. But Ron said there are plenty of people rushing to protect you, so why bother?" "It's not the same thing," Harry muttered. Hermione's expression turned somber. She wasn't sure whether to be moved by Harry's determination, despite his flawed reasoning, or saddened by Ron's indifference. The journey to the library was challenging. Before leaving the dormitory, Hermione knew that even though Professor McGonagall had informed everyone that the school had determined she wasn't the one who entered her name into the Goblet of Fire, gaining everyone's understanding was another matter. She thought she was prepared for the strange looks from others, but the reality was harsher than she had imagined. Along the way, the Hufflepuff classmates she encountered didn't hide their disdain. They didn't care how her name ended up in the Goblet of Fire. To them, the undeniable fact was that she had stolen the glory that rightfully belonged to Cedric and Hufflepuff. As for the Slytherins, their looks clearly conveyed their disdain for Hermione. They thought she was a clown, a pathetic person on the brink of ruin. Hermione had hoped that Ravenclaw students would be more sensible, but she was disappointed. As she and Harry walked through a corridor, they overheard a group of Ravenclaw girls whispering, "Who knows what that's about? Maybe it's just a cover-up for the scandal." Harry, incensed, moved forward to confront them, but Hermione held him back, choosing to continue on in silence. The pair soon arrived at the Hogwarts library. Mrs. Pince, the librarian, was glaring at a group of young witches who were giggling behind the bookshelves, casting glances at a boy seated in the reading area. Victor Krum, with a book open before him, appeared displeased, his expression darkened by either the content of the book or the intrusive stares. He shook his head dismissively, then noticed two familiar faces entering the library. "It's you, Hermione," Crumb said, standing up and deftly maneuvering around his stool to approach Harry and Hermione. However, as he neared them, Harry suddenly stepped forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Hermione. His eyes were wary, and his hand hovered near his pocket, ready to draw his wand at a moment's notice. "Don't come any closer," Harry warned, his tone threatening. End of this chapter. Chapter 578. Friendly Crumb. Harry's furious actions left everyone watching in shock. Even Mrs. Pince, who usually couldn't stand the starstruck young witches in her library, was too stunned to be angry. She had tolerated their antics because Crumb was a guest from Durmstrang. But what was Harry Potter doing? Crumb's eyebrows, which had just relaxed, furrowed once more. He looked at the boy in front of him, who was half a head shorter, with confusion in his eyes. He knew the green-eyed boy was Harry Potter, someone arguably more famous than himself. They had met face-to-face twice before, once at the World Cup, and again yesterday, when Harry and his friends had shown him around the Hogwarts campus. On both occasions, Harry had been quite friendly, especially his red-haired friend, who was a fan of Crumb. But now, Harry seemed to be on the verge of attacking him. Despite the situation, Harry's posture and intense gaze were intimidating, suggesting he had received some training. "Oh, come on, Harry!" Hermione finally snapped out of her shock and yelled in panic. She was probably the only one who understood why Harry was acting so extremely. He seemed to view all unfamiliar people as potential threats. While the feeling of being protected was comforting, it wouldn't be good to have a dispute with Durmstrang's champion. "Let's talk this out," Hermione said, pulling Harry behind her without further explanation. She was ready to explain to Crumb, but Mrs. Pince's disapproving glare made her shudder, so she whispered to Crumb instead. The library entrance was bustling with people, making it an unsuitable place for a conversation. By some strange coincidence, Hermione led the two boys to the spot where Professor Blaine had rescued the house elves last time. When she turned around, she noticed Crumb examining the corridor and the closed classrooms. "Oh!" A spider the size of a baby's fist crawled through the massive web above their heads. Hermione flipped her hair and spoke in an awkward tone. "We don't usually use all these classrooms. Some have been left untouched for centuries, so they don't look very tidy." Harry curled his lips. This wasn't the time for a tour guide's explanation, especially not to Crumb. "I think it's interesting," Crumb said unexpectedly. He didn't mind the shabby environment and didn't react to Harry's earlier outburst. He gazed with interest at a sculpture with a broken arm at the end of the corridor. "Our castle isn't as tall as Hogwarts, only 4 floors. It's not as comfortable or interesting as here." Harry realized that Victor Crumb didn't carry the airs of an international Quidditch star. He usually didn't talk much, likely due to concerns about his English pronunciation. Just like now, he was mumbling about Durmstrang, occasionally slipping into Bulgarian, leaving Harry and Hermione unable to understand. "Can you get me an autograph?" Crumb suddenly asked, looking at Harry and Hermione. It was an intriguing request, as people usually asked Crumb for autographs. When Harry had shown Beauxbatons and Durmstrang students around campus yesterday, many Hogwarts girls had rushed to Crumb for his autograph. Harry and Hermione exchanged surprised glances, then a realization dawned on them. "Whose autograph do you want?" Hermione asked cautiously. "Mr. Blaine," Crumb replied, a bit sheepishly. "I don't know many people. I wonder if Mr. Blaine would find it, presumptuous," Harry finished for him, understanding Crumb's hesitation. Atticus Blaine helped Crumb fill in the word he couldn't spell. To be honest, Crumb was much easier to communicate with than Atticus had anticipated. The most important thing was that Crumb showed no hostility toward Hermione, who was also a competitor. He even congratulated her, and his tone was far more pleasant than Ron's had been the previous night. When Atticus asked Crumb why he didn't ask Malfoy for help, considering Crumb had been sitting next to Malfoy at dinner for the past 2 days, and both Atticus and Ron had noticed Malfoy being particularly courteous to Crumb mumbled, "D something." Atticus couldn't hear it clearly, but it seemed to imply that Crumb found Malfoy unreliable. This evaluation improved Atticus's impression of Crumb significantly. At the same time, Atticus realized he had been a bit rude. "Okay, I'll go figure it out." Atticus accepted Crumb's request as an apology. As they started walking back, Crumb explained to Hermione why he was in the library. "I'm researching information to prepare for my first task," he began. At the mention of the competition, Hermione's expression turned worried. She was curious about the direction of Crumb's research, but realized she shouldn't ask, as the competition rules required her to rely entirely on herself. Asking about another competitor's thoughts would obviously be cheating. "Prepare for what?" Atticus asked, blinking in confusion. He had learned from Hermione that Barty Crouch's instructions to the competitors were vague, only advising them to be mentally prepared for the challenges ahead. But the Ministry of Magic didn't say anything, did they? What can you find in the books? Unlike Hermione, Atticus was more open-minded and didn't care much about the rules, so he asked directly. Crumb, showing his magnanimity, shared his thoughts. "Yeah, they didn't say it, but there are traces," Crumb said, raising his thick eyebrows. He glanced at Hermione, who was pretending not to care, and the show-off in his eyes softened the intimidation his idol status might have brought. "The specific tasks are top secret, but generally speaking, they fall into certain categories. If you find records of previous competitions, you can probably guess what they want the competitors to deal with." "Oh," Hermione's eyes suddenly lit up. It was such an obvious idea. If it weren't for her concerns about her competitor status and Ron's unconventional behavior, she would have thought of it herself. "I'm not familiar with the Hogwarts library," Crumb admitted in his awkward accent. "I can't find any records of this. Your librarian doesn't seem to like people asking questions." "I can help. I'm quite familiar with the library," Hermione said cheerfully. Atticus, who felt like a bodyguard, shrugged helplessly after hearing Hermione's offer. He had a feeling he wouldn't be leaving the library anytime soon. As expected, Hermione gathered all the books in the library that could be related to the Triwizard Tournament. The pile of books was so large it could practically build a wall. The three of them spent hours recording key content from the books, only taking breaks for lunch and dinner. Atticus hurried downstairs to fetch food for them. Of course, he also encountered Ron in the Great Hall, but when he asked Ron to join them in the library to help Hermione and Crumb, Ron hesitated. He mentioned he had plans with Seamus to play gobstones that afternoon. This left Atticus feeling a bit annoyed and puzzled. He had a vague sense that Ron had been deliberately avoiding Hermione since the previous night. However, he didn't have much time to dwell on this thought. After it briefly crossed his mind, he set it aside. The most important thing now was to help Hermione. "It's just crazy," Atticus Blaine muttered as he and Hermione exited the library, their arms laden with parchments detailing the history of the Triwizard Tournament from centuries past. Madame Pince had insisted they leave, her patience worn thin. Crumb had departed earlier, mentioning that Professor Karkaroff wouldn't allow them to linger in the castle too late. They actually had the champions face dementors, werewolves, inferi, and even chickens, Hermione exclaimed, her voice rising in disbelief. As they crossed the covered bridge, she suddenly halted, turning to face the shimmering black lake. Her voice broke as she shouted, "But this is all illegal." End of this chapter. Chapter 579. Sirius's Reply. Hermione had braced herself for the ridicule and eye-rolling she might face for becoming a champion, but as the new week began and classes resumed, she realized the situation was far more serious than she had anticipated. She had assumed that any conflict would be directed solely at her, but it quickly became apparent that the entire Gryffindor house was embroiled in the matter. The last thing Hermione wanted was to face Hufflepuff, yet on a particularly unfortunate Monday morning, her first class was herbology with them. The atmosphere in the classroom was palpably tense. Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs were divided into two distinct groups, neither speaking nor cooperating with the other. When Finch Fletchley pretended to miss his bouncing bulb, allowing it to hit Hermione on the nose, many Hufflepuff students who had been secretly watching her burst into laughter. Professor Sprout reprimanded Finch Fletchley, but her tone was mild, as if she didn't take the incident seriously. Furthermore, she seemed less inclined to call on Neville or Hermione to answer questions in class. Thanks to Hagrid's insistence, Tuesday's Care of Magical Creatures class with Slytherin was surprisingly uneventful. However, the Slytherin girls continued to point and whisper about Hermione. When Malfoy approached and muttered something to Pansy Parkinson, she immediately clutched her belly and laughed. The repercussions of Hermione's selection as a champion extended beyond Hogwarts. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang expressed their dissatisfaction in their own ways, viewing all of Hogwarts as untrustworthy. To demonstrate their discontent, the Beauxbaton students stopped eating in the Great Hall. After each class, they hurriedly left the castle to return to their carriage. Fred discovered from the kitchen that the Beauxbaton students had requested the house elves to deliver their meals to the carriage. Meanwhile, the Durmstrang students were determined not to let Victor Krum fail. Whenever Krum appeared in the Great Hall, he was surrounded by a group of his schoolmates. Just as Harry feared for Hermione's safety within the castle, Professor Karkaroff was equally concerned about potential conspiracies against Victor. If they're so scared, why don't they just give up the tournament and go back home? Harry exclaimed angrily on Wednesday morning when he noticed the Beauxbaton students were still absent from the Ravenclaw table. "Stop it, Harry," Hermione said as calmly as she could. "Their concerns are valid. After all, the person who put my name in the Goblet of Fire hasn't been found. If someone truly wants to tarnish Hogwarts' reputation, targeting their champions would be the most effective way." Harry frowned, instinctively wanting to argue, but after a moment of reflection, he realized Hermione's point wasn't entirely unfounded. His shoulders slumped, and he looked a bit defeated. Ron, sitting across from Harry, glanced up at him, but when he noticed Hermione watching him, he quickly looked away. The sound of flapping wings filled the Great Hall as the morning mail arrived. An owl dropped a letter in front of Harry, instantly lifting his spirits. "Oh, it's from Sirius!" he exclaimed excitedly after glancing at the name on the envelope. Eagerly, he tore it open and scanned the contents. "Sirius wants to talk to us personally about the champions." Hermione and Ron leaned in to read the letter as Harry spread it out on the table. Sirius said that it wasn't convenient to explain everything in the letter. Atticus Blaine wanted to speak with us in person, and he must have thought the matter was urgent, as he hoped we could meet him in Hogsmeade this Saturday. "He'll be waiting for us at the Three Broomsticks," Harry exclaimed. "But isn't it not a Hogsmeade weekend?" Hermione questioned, taking Sirius's letter and reading it. Her instinctive retort came as Harry mentioned the meeting. "Oh, Professor Blaine hasn't sealed all the secret passages to Hogsmeade, has he?" Harry replied with a hint of excitement. He hadn't seen his godfather since the start of the school year, and the prospect of visiting on a non-open day suggested that Sirius knew of a way they could manage it. This implied a certain level of approval from Sirius for Harry to take a risk. Sirius's letter seemed to bolster Harry's spirits. He eagerly anticipated the meeting, and the gloom of the past few days lifted. Although Hermione wasn't as optimistic, she recognized that any help, however small, was valuable. She appreciated that Sirius, now busy with his duties as an Auror at the Ministry of Magic, was willing to make time for them. Thanks to Sirius's supportive attitude, both Harry and Hermione were in better spirits, and even the odd looks from other houses during class were more bearable. Hermione wasn't with them for the afternoon classes. After finishing the day's lessons, Harry and Ron headed to the Great Hall together. Before dinner, Harry needed to complete his daily training on the playground. Over half an hour later, when he returned with Hermione, Ron had already left the Great Hall. "Did you notice something seemed off about Ron?" Harry asked, not finding Ron when he returned. He sat down, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a napkin, loosened his collar, and frowned. Hermione, also wiping her sweat, paused. She avoided Harry's gaze and asked as casually as possible, "What's wrong?" Harry didn't answer immediately. Lately, his focus had been on Hermione being selected as a champion, but he still noticed something was amiss with Ron. Harry frowned, trying to pinpoint the changes in Ron's behavior in the dormitory and class, but he couldn't find the right words to describe it. "Well, he seems preoccupied and unwilling to talk," Harry finally said. Hermione quickly shoveled food into her mouth, hoping Harry would drop the subject, but he continued to look at her, determined to get an answer. "Well, he's probably worried too," Hermione replied vaguely, grabbing a glass of pumpkin juice and drinking it, no longer paying attention to Harry, who seemed unsatisfied with her response. After dinner, Harry and Hermione didn't return to the common room because they had Professor Blaine's class later. If they went back now, they'd waste time going back and forth. At the dining table, Neville and several girls from the Quidditch team were also busy finishing their homework. Once the Great Hall emptied, the Gryffindors and other students needing to attend class hurried upstairs together. They found the physical education classroom by familiar means. As they approached the corridor outside the classroom, they heard cheerful laughter coming from inside. Harry immediately frowned upon recognizing Malfoy's voice among the laughter. The good mood brought by Sirius's letter vanished. He glanced at Hermione subconsciously and noticed her expression looked a bit troubled. The room was dimly lit, casting an ominous shadow over the scene. It was clear that she shared the same predicament as Atticus Blaine. As the Gryffindor group entered the classroom, their cheerful laughter abruptly ceased. Inside, the Slytherins fixed their gaze on Harry and Hermione with mocking eyes. "Hey!" Pansy Parkinson, with her usual disdainful expression, emerged from the crowd. She wore a smug grin as she pointed to the badge pinned to her chest, directing her attention to Hermione. "Do you like this, Granger?" she taunted. Hermione pressed her lips together tightly, while Harry's face turned ashen upon noticing the badges adorning the Slytherins' chests. Stepping forward from the group, his voice was low and menacing. "Take that ridiculous thing off, Parkinson, or you'll regret it." End of this chapter. Chapter 580, The Sword Pansy. Parkinson stood confidently, flanked by Malfoy and Millicent, each Slytherin student proudly displaying a silver-green badge on their chest. The badge initially bore the image of a beaver, but when Pansy pressed it, the beaver's fur elongated into brown hair, and its features morphed rapidly into a caricature of Hermione's face. The transformation retained the beaver's exaggerated incisors and body, mocking Hermione in a cruel parody. The Slytherins followed Pansy's lead, and Harry watched as the beaver's face was thrust into Hermione's likeness. Laughter erupted from the Hufflepuff students, including Ernie and Finch Fletchley, who had previously been friendly with Harry. The Slytherins, of course, reveled in the mockery, their laughter echoing like a chorus of derision. Even the Ravenclaw girls, though not participating, observed with detached amusement. Thankfully, Cho Chang refrained from joining in, casting worried glances at Harry, while Luna seemed lost in her own world, staring dreamily at the ceiling. Cedric, another champion, appeared uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene. Harry's emotions were a tumultuous mix of anger and disbelief. The Slytherins, those detestable snakes, had remained silent in Hagrid's class, yet they chose Professor Blaine's PE class to collectively ridicule Hermione. Did they not realize the potential consequences of provoking Professor Blaine? Harry couldn't spare a thought for what Professor Blaine might do if he witnessed this scene. His priority was to defend Hermione's dignity. "Take that stupid thing off, Parkinson, or I'll make you pay," Harry growled, his voice a low rumble of fury. "Come on, Harry." To his surprise, it was Hermione who intervened, placing a restraining hand on his arm. Despite the badges that demeaned her, Hermione's voice remained steady. "It's not worth it. They'll always find ways to showcase their superficiality and stupidity." "What's wrong?" Pansy taunted, pushing her chest out defiantly. "Don't you like this, Granger? We're all supporting you. Look at those beautiful front teeth. Maybe they'll protect you in a pinch." Her words were venomous, and even Hermione's composure faltered, her fists clenching and eyes flashing with anger. Harry's rage threatened to overflow, and if Parkinson hadn't been a girl, he might have charged forward, fists ready to strike. "I'll say it one last time." Harry's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Take off that stupid badge." "And if we refuse, Potter?" Draco challenged, stepping forward with a smirk. "What are you going to do?" In an instant, Harry drew his wand, and he wasn't alone. Fred, George, Angelina, Ginny, and others followed suit, their wands aimed at the Slytherins. The Hufflepuff students gasped collectively, but instead of intervening, they retreated, leaving the space open for confrontation. Malfoy and Parkinson, far from intimidated, seemed to revel in the provocation. Millicent even removed her badge and placed it on her head, making the mockery even more blatant to the Gryffindors. "Don't do it!" Hermione shouted urgently, breaking away from the group and turning her back on the Slytherins. Hermione stretched out her arms to stop Harry and their fellow Gryffindors. "Put your wand down, Harry, and don't do anything," she urged. "Not unless they remove that badge that's meant to humiliate you first." Harry's green eyes blazed with anger as he glared at Malfoy. "Don't fall for the trap, Harry. Can't you all see? This is a setup," Hermione pleaded urgently. "They're just waiting for you to use your wand." She was breathing heavily as she continued. "Professor Blaine told us that students in physical education class are never allowed to use wands during conflicts in the castle. If you do, he'll impose severe punishments. Believe me, you don't want that. He might put you in detention, deduct points, or even expel you from the class." Hermione's warning was like a cold shower, jolting the Gryffindor students, including Harry, back to their senses. They all recalled Professor Blaine's stern words. Harry noticed a flicker of disappointment on Malfoy's face, which seemed to confirm Hermione's warning. The thought of being excluded from Professor Blaine's class was unbearable for everyone. Harry clenched his teeth, frustrated by Malfoy and the Slytherin's cunning and malice. "What's the matter, Potter?" Malfoy taunted, unwilling to let his plan fail. "Are you starting to appreciate our creativity?" Pansy Parkinson joined in, producing a bag filled with the same badges they wore. "I have plenty more here. Would you like one?" Hermione continued to persuade everyone to lower their wands, but Cedric Diggory finally stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. He pushed through the crowd, frowning at the Slytherins. "Is this really necessary? We're all part of Hogwarts, classmates in this class. Professor Blaine certainly doesn't want us fighting among ourselves." "We're supporting you, Diggory," Malfoy replied with a slick smile reminiscent of Professor Karkaroff, the headmaster of Durmstrang. He took the bag from Pansy, bypassed Cedric, and approached the Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw students, shaking the bag in his hand. "Anyone want to show Diggory a little more support?" No one was fooled. Everyone knew Malfoy and the Slytherins were targeting Granger and Potter. Yet some Hufflepuff students looked eager, as many would relish the chance to undermine Gryffindor, especially since the victory at Hogwarts was rumored to depend on a joint score between Diggory and Granger, which put Cedric in a difficult position. "That poor little bastard," one of the Weasley twins muttered behind Harry. Harry heard the sound of sleeves being rolled up, reminding him that he didn't need a wand to handle Malfoy. Just as Harry and the twins prepared to confront Malfoy, someone acted faster. A sudden clang echoed from the end of the Gryffindor line. Harry turned to see what was happening, but before he could fully turn, a dark figure with a glint of cold steel flashed past him. His eyes followed the figure, watching as someone wielding a sword from the classroom's wall armor charged at Malfoy with astonishing speed. In the blink of an eye, the figure stood before Malfoy, leaving everyone in shock, mouths agape, as they stared at the person brandishing the sword. "Hand it over, Malfoy," Neville demanded, his voice firm and unwavering. The sword's edge gleamed with a cold, menacing light, quivering slightly as it hovered just a few feet from Malfoy's forehead. Neville's face was flushed with determination, his teeth clenched in resolve. Outside the door, Atticus Blaine observed the tense scene unfold, raising an eyebrow in intrigue. The October update had concluded, leaving him eager to stir things up in November.